He grabbed her arm right there in the middle of the street in front of God and everyone and yanked her back like she was something he'd misplaced. "You think you can just walk away from me, Eliza?" Nathan Caldwell's voice was low and dangerous. "After everything I did for you." She looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at his face, and she said very quietly, very clearly, "Let go of me." He didn't, so she made him. That was the moment Silver Creek decided Eliza Whitmore was trouble. What they missed, what every single one of them missed, was that she was the only person in that town brave enough to tell the truth. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first man who rejected her did it with a smile. That was somehow the worst part. Not the rejection itself. Eliza Whitmore had survived worse things than a stranger's opinion, but the particular quality of Gideon Marsh's smile when he did it. Patient. Almost kind. The smile of a man who believed he was doing her a favor by wasting as little of her time as possible. "Miss Whitmore." He folded his hands on top of his desk. "I run a serious operation here. 40 head of cattle, 3 working horses, 2 full-time ranch hands, and a seasonal crew that comes in for roundup. What I need is someone who can pull their weight alongside men who've been doing this work their whole lives." "I understand," Eliza said. "That's exactly the kind of work I'm applying for." His smile didn't waver. "With respect, ma'am, it's not the kind of work that's, well, suitable." "Suitable," she repeated, "for a woman." The word landed in this room like something dropped from a height. Eliza looked at Gideon Marsh, at his carefully pressed jacket, his neat desk, the framed portrait of his wife behind him, and she made a choice. She did not argue. She did not explain herself further. She had learned in the past year of her life that certain men had already finished the conversation before it started, and spending energy trying to reopen it was like pouring water into sand. She picked up her travel bag. "Thank you for your time," she said. "Of course." Still smiling. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She walked out of Gideon Marsh's office and into the sharp Montana air and stood very still for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds to let the heat behind her eyes cool down. 10 seconds to breathe. Then she pulled the map from her pocket and crossed off the first name. 5 ranches left. Silver Creek, Montana was not a large town. It sat at the base of the northern mountain range, like something that had been set down there and forgotten about. A main road, a cluster of wooden buildings, a church, a general store, a feed supplier, and the accumulated opinions of roughly 300 people who had mostly known each other their entire lives. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where the arrival of a strange woman with a travel bag and no local connections was noticed immediately and classified almost as quickly. Eliza had ridden into Silver Creek 3 days ago. She had arrived with a plan, a list of ranches and businesses that were reportedly looking for help, and the complete and unshakable intention of finding work before her money ran out. She had worked too hard and survived too much to arrive at a new town and fail within the first week. The plan was not going well. The morning she'd arrived, she'd gone first to the boarding house to arrange a room for the nights she'd need before finding a permanent position. The woman who ran it, a Mrs. Eleanor Dabb Stout and suspicious in the way of someone who had been managing other people's problems for 30 years, had looked Eliza up and down with an expression that did not quite become unfriendly, but made very clear that it was considering its options. "You're alone," Mrs. Dabb said. "Yes, ma'am." "No family in the area?" "No, ma'am." "No husband?" The pause before Eliza answered was exactly 1 second. "No, ma'am." Another long look. "Where are you coming from?" "Clearwater County. I managed my family's farm there for several years. The property was sold recently, and I'm looking for a new position." "Managed," Mrs. Dabb said with the same tone Gideon Marsh would use the next morning, as though the word were being tested for structural integrity. "Yes, ma'am. Farming operations, crop management, livestock care, food storage, and preservation. I have experience in all of it." Mrs. Dabb gave the counter in front of her a small, unnecessary wipe with a cloth. "Well, I can give you a room for 2 nights at the standard rate. After that, we'll see. That was 3 days ago. She was now on the second morning of seeing, and the seeing was not encouraging. She went to Douglas Fitch after leaving Gideon Marsh. Fitch ran the grain and supply business on the main road, a different kind of operation, less physical labor, more organization and record-keeping. She had done both. She could do both. She laid out her qualifications for him with the same direct clarity she'd offered Marsh, and she watched him listen with the same surface attention that masked the same foregone conclusion. "I appreciate your coming in," Fitch said when she finished. He was a thin man with careful eyes and the manner of someone who perpetually calculated the social cost of every decision before making it. "I want to be straight with you, Miss Whitmore, because I think you deserve a straight answer." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "My clientele is almost entirely male. Ranchers, farmers, suppliers. Men who have been coming to this business for 15-20 years. They have certain expectations about the nature of the operation." "The nature of the operation," she said. "Meaning, who is behind the counter?" He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless reasonableness. "I've built a reputation here over many years. I can't risk disrupting the relationships I've established. You're telling me that your clients would take their business elsewhere if a woman organized your inventory and managed your order records. I'm telling you that it's a risk I'm not in a position to take." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She thought about asking him whether he'd verified that assumption with any of his actual clients, or whether he was simply protecting a position based on what he imagined they might think. She thought about pointing out that the risk he was describing was entirely theoretical, while the quality of work she was offering was entirely concrete. She thought about all of it. Then she said, "I understand. Thank you for being direct. Of course, I'm sorry I can't help." She walked out. Second name crossed off. The feed store owner was quicker about it. He had barely let her finish introducing herself before he was shaking his head with the apologetic haste of a man who wanted to get something unpleasant over with. "Already got my boy helping out," he said. His boy was visible through the back window, a teenager who looked approximately 16 and was moving feed sacks with an enthusiasm that suggested he'd rather be doing anything else. "But I appreciate you coming in." Third name crossed off. The livery stable was the first place where someone was honest about it in a way that felt less like professional courtesy and more like an accident. The man who ran it was younger than the others, closer to Eliza's age, with an open face and the air of someone who had not yet fully learned how to construct the smooth surface that most adults deployed in uncomfortable situations. "I mean," he said and stopped. "Look, I don't personally, it's not that I think you couldn't." Another stop. He rubbed the back of his neck. "My father owns this place. He's in Billings right now. I can't make hiring decisions without him. I'm sorry." Eliza believed approximately half of this. The half about his father she believed. The half about the decision she was less sure of. But she also saw in his genuinely uncomfortable expression that he was a person dealing with a situation that made him feel bad about himself, which was at least marginally different from not feeling anything at all. "No need to apologize," she said. "I understand. If the position is still open when your father returns, please let me know." Yeah," he said. "I will." He wouldn't. She knew he wouldn't. But it was a kinder ending to the conversation, and some conversations deserved a kinder ending. Four names crossed off. She stood on the main road of Silver Creek in the late afternoon of her second day and looked at the two remaining names on her list. One was a small cattle operation on the south end of town, owned by a man named Harold Sutter. The other was something else entirely written at the very top edge of the map, up past the point where the road became a trail and the trail climbed into the mountains. She went to Sutter first. Harold Sutter was a compact, weathered man in his 50s who looked like someone who had spent every one of those 50 years squinting into wind. He had no desk, no office, no pretense of formal professional courtesy. He met her in his yard, heard approximately 90 seconds of what she was saying, and then cut her off. "Miss," he said. She stopped. "I'm going to save us both some time." He crossed his arms. "I need someone I can count on completely. Someone who can do what needs doing when it needs doing without me having to think about whether there's going to be a problem. Someone reliable." I'm reliable, she said. I can give you references from... It's not about references. The word came out flat and final. I need someone useful, not someone I have to worry about. There it was. The cleanest version of what all four of the others had been trying to say. I need someone useful, not someone I have to worry about. Said without malice. Said without cruelty. Said with the complete comfortable certainty of a man who had never in his life had to examine the assumption underneath the sentence. Eliza Whitmore stood in Harold Sutter's yard in the cold Montana afternoon and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was something older than both of those things, something that had been building for a very long time through the drought and the debt and Nathan's quiet, careful exit from her life, through her father's death and her brother's brief, useless letters, through 5 months of trying and being turned away and trying again. A feeling she didn't have an exact word for, except that it sat very heavy in the center of her chest, and it had been sitting there long enough that she had almost stopped noticing its weight. I see, she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. Thank you for your time. She turned and walked back to the hitching post where her horse was tied. She untied the reins with hands that did not shake. She was very particular about that, about the hands not shaking, because the hands were something she could control, and she stood there for a moment with her back to Harold Sutter's yard and her eyes on the main road. 5 rejections. 5 doors. 5 versions of the same message delivered in different registers of politeness. She pulled the map out of her pocket. One name left, the one at the top of the map. The one nobody in Silver Creek seemed to want to say out loud without lowering their voice first. Storm Ranch, Caleb Storm. She had heard his name mentioned twice already, and both times had come with the careful, instinctive caution that people reserved for things they were genuinely uncertain about. Not the comfortable authority of someone describing a known quantity. The hesitation of people who knew enough to be uneasy, but not enough to be specific. She had heard dangerous. She had heard not right in the head. She had heard been up there alone so long he's gone half wild. She had heard from the old man at the feed store that the last person who had ridden up to Storm Ranch on business had come back down, reporting that Storm had met him at the property line with a rifle and told him to turn around without explaining why. She had also heard nothing specific, nothing concrete, nothing that amounted to an actual documented account of Caleb Storm doing something genuinely terrible, as opposed to being someone that Silver Creek found uncomfortable because he had declined to participate in the town's social economy and had been punishing him in reputation ever since. The map showed that Storm Ranch sat 2 to 3 hours' ride north of Silver Creek, up into the mountains. If she left now, she might make it before full dark. She might. She looked up at the North Ridge. Then she looked back at the crossed-off names on her map. Then she made the decision she'd known probably since this morning she was eventually going to make. She mounted her horse and headed north. She had not been riding for 20 minutes when she heard the sound behind her hooves on the road coming fast. She moved to the side automatically and looked back, expecting a rancher or a supply rider passing through. It was Mrs. Dabb. The boarding house owner was in a small trap buggy, moving at a brisk pace, and she pulled up alongside Eliza with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Dabb. I heard you're heading up to Storm's place." News traveled fast in Silver Creek. Eliza had apparently left Sutter's yard less than 40 minutes ago. "Word gets around," she said mildly. "It does." Mrs. Dabb's hands were firm on her reins. I'm not sure why exactly I came after you. I suppose I wanted to say something before you went up there." "What would you like to say?" A pause. "Caleb Storm is not. He's not what the rumors make him. Not exactly. He's a hard man. He lost something years ago that changed him. He's not easy. He's not friendly. He's not the kind of man who makes people feel welcome." She stopped. "But I don't actually believe he's dangerous. I want you to know that. The stories that go around about him are mostly just stories. Because people don't understand him, and people in this town don't like what they don't understand." Eliza looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Dabb met her eyes and then looked away at the road ahead. Because I've watched you walk in and out of this town for 2 days, and I haven't said a single useful thing to you, and that sits poorly with me. A beat. I should have, when you came to my door, I should have... She stopped again. Just be careful. And don't let the stories substitute for the actual man. That's all. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her buggy around and headed back toward town. Eliza watched her go for a moment. Then she turned back to the north and kept riding. The trail up to Storm Ranch was steep and rough, and it got rougher the higher she climbed. The pine trees closed in around her, dense and dark, and smelling of cold sap and mountain air. The light was changing the golden thinning of late afternoon, heading toward the blue-gray transition that came before dusk. She pushed her horse to move as quickly as the terrain safely allowed. She was thinking about what Mrs. Dabb had said. He lost something years ago that changed him. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to lose something years ago that changed you. She thought about whether that loss made you dangerous, or whether it just made you someone who had built walls high enough that the outside couldn't reach you anymore. She thought about whether those two things looked the same from the outside. She was still thinking about it when she came around a bend in the trail, and the path ahead was blocked, not by a fallen tree, not by a rock slide, by a man standing squarely in the middle of the trail with a rifle held low at his side, not raised, not aimed, just present, and the absolute stillness of someone who had known she was coming for quite some time. Eliza pulled her horse to a stop. Her heart kicked hard once and then steadied. She looked at the man. How was a big man? Taller than she'd expected somehow, though she hadn't really had a specific expectation. Dark hair going gray, a full beard, and eyes that were doing in person exactly what she'd imagined from Mrs. Dabb's description, looking at her with a quality of attention so complete and focused. It was almost physical. The rifle stayed low. He made no move. "You're lost," he said. It was not a question. "I'm not," she said. "I'm looking for Storm Ranch." "You found it." He said it without any particular inflection, not welcoming, not threatening, informational. "Trail you're on is the property line. What you're looking for is further up." "I know," she said. "I'd like to speak with Caleb Storm about possible employment." Something shifted in his expression very slightly. Not a smile. Not anything as readable as a smile. But something. "Most people who ride up this trail don't usually make it past the first bend," he said. "The first bend's behind me," she said. He looked at her horse. He looked at her travel bag. He looked at her face with the specific measuring quality of someone evaluating something real, rather than assigning a category. It was so different from the way the 5 men in Silver Creek had looked at her, or not looked at her, that she noticed it immediately. "I'm Caleb Storm," he said. She had figured as much. "Eliza Whitmore," she said. He did not offer his hand. He did not step aside. He stood in the trail and looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to have a shape to it, and she sat on her horse and let him look, because she had nothing to hide and nothing to defend. And the only thing she'd come up this mountain with was exactly what she actually was. "You'd better come up to the cabin," he said finally. "The trail gets worse before it gets better, and you'll lose the light if you wait." He turned and walked back up the trail without looking to see if she followed. She followed. The cabin, when she reached it, told her something that the town of Silver Creek had completely missed about this man. Because the town had said he's strange, he's difficult, he's dangerous, he's lost. And all of those things may or may not have been true. But the cabin said something different. The cabin said, this is a man who builds things to last, who pays attention to what matters and ignores what doesn't, who has organized his life according to his own clear logic and has followed that logic with total consistency. Caleb Storm held the cabin door open for her, a small gesture, automatic, the kind that comes from the bones of how someone was raised, and she walked inside. It was warm. The fire had been built up properly, not hastily. The work table was covered in maps and notes, all arranged with the particular organized chaos of an active mind that knew where everything was. There were books. More books than she'd expected, more books than most people she knew owned. There were tools hanging in careful order along one wall. There was a shelf of medical supplies, bandages, wound treatment, the kind of comprehensive kit that a person builds when they live far from a doctor and have learned that being unprepared is a luxury they can't afford. She looked at all of it. She looked at him. "Sit down," he said. He was already moving toward the fire, not with hospitality, but with the functional attention of a man managing a space. "It'll get cold fast once the sun goes." She sat. "I'll come directly to the point," she said. "Please," he said. Not sarcastically, genuinely. "I've been in Silver Creek for 2 days," she said. "I've spoken with 5 people about employment. All 5 declined. The reasons given varied, but the underlying reason was consistent." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a woman, and I'm alone, and I have no local connections, and most of the men in that town decided what I was before I finished my first sentence." Caleb Storm put a piece of wood on the fire and stood up. He turned to look at her. "What are your qualifications?" he said. Just that. No reaction to what she'd said. No discomfort. No reassurance. Just the next logical question. Something in Eliza's chest, something that had been pulled very tight for a very long time, eased exactly 1 degree. She told him everything. The Whitmore ranch, the size, the operation, the years of management she'd done while her father was sick. The specific skills: crop planning, food storage and preservation, livestock care, basic veterinary knowledge, organizational systems for supplies and labor. She told him about the accounting. She told him about the winter planning she'd developed, the system of inventorying and rotating stores that had kept their food supplies consistent even through the bad years. He listened. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward when she tried to explain it to herself. He actually listened. His eyes stayed on her face. He did not glance at the window or at his hands or at some middle distance where the real shape of his decision was already forming. He listened to every word she said, as though the content of those words was genuinely relevant to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "My winter food stores," he said, "are a problem." "I can see that," she said. She had noticed the storage arrangement from across the room. "The organization system I use." He stopped. "I don't have one. I do what needs doing in the order it comes up. It works, but not efficiently." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at her with that direct, measuring expression. "What would you change first?" "The root cellar," she said immediately. "Whatever your current ventilation system is, it's not adequate. You're getting condensation in there. I can tell from the moisture pattern on the outside wall. That means you're rotting the bottom of your stores earlier than you should be. Fix that first, then reorganize the arrangement so you're accessing in the right order. You're probably losing 30% of your stored food before it needs to be lost." Silence. "That's a problem," he said. "It's a fixable problem," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something directly, because I think you'd prefer that to the other option." "I would," she said. "I'm not easy to work with. I don't explain myself. I don't make conversation for the sake of it. I have opinions, and I say them, and I don't spend time softening them. I've lived alone up here for years because that arrangement suited me better than the alternative, and most of it still suits me." He paused. "But I'm also fair. I pay what I say I'll pay, and I expect the work I've agreed to receive. If you do the work, I won't question how you do it. If something's wrong, I'll say so directly, and I expect the same in return." Eliza looked at him. A man who had just told her in the most undecorated terms possible exactly what he was. No performance, no attempt to make himself more palatable. Just, "This is what I am, and here are the conditions, and you can decide." She had met hundreds of men in her life who were more charming than Caleb Storm. She had met exactly 2 or 3 who were more honest. "I have a condition of my own," she said. "Say it." "I'm not here because you're the last option," she said. "I need you to understand that. I'm here because the work is real, and the terms seem fair, and you're the first person in 2 days who listened to what I actually said, instead of what they expected me to say." She met his eyes directly. "But if the arrangement stops being fair, I'll tell you, and I'll leave. Not out of stubbornness. Because I know what my work is worth, and I won't discount it." Caleb Storm looked at her for a long, still moment. And then he said something she hadn't expected from any man in Silver Creek. "That's the right position to take," he said. "I'd think less of you if it were otherwise." He named his terms. The wage was fair, more than fair, actually enough, that she wondered briefly if he'd made an error, and then realized he hadn't. He named the specific work he needed and asked whether she was able to address it. She confirmed she was. He said she would start in the morning. "There's a room off the main cabin," he said. "Small but solid. You're welcome to it." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, and there was no rudeness in it, just the flat practicality of a man who didn't traffic in social formalities. "It's part of the arrangement." She nodded. She accepted the arrangement, and she went to the small room he showed her, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Outside, the wind was picking up through the pines. She could hear Caleb Storm moving around the main cabin, the deliberate, unhurried sounds of a man managing his space at the end of a day. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the 5 men who had told her no. She thought about Nathan Caldwell, far away in Clearwater County, in the neat new life he had arranged for himself after deciding she wasn't the right fit for it. She thought about what it meant that the person who had finally offered her a straight hearing was a man everyone in Silver Creek was afraid of. What that said about fear and about what people were actually afraid of when they said they were afraid of something. She didn't have the complete answer to that yet, but she had the beginning of it. She lay back on the narrow bed and let her eyes close. Tomorrow, the work would begin. Tomorrow, she would start making herself indispensable in a place that hadn't expected her to a man who said exactly what he meant and nothing else. She could work with that. She had worked with harder things. What she didn't know. What she had no way to know yet. Lying in the dark in Caleb Storm's mountain cabin while the wind moved through the trees outside was that she wasn't the only one who had just made a decision that would change everything. That the man on the other side of the wall sitting in the firelight with his maps and his silence had looked at her and seen something he had not expected to see. Something that was going to be much more complicated than either of them was prepared for. And that 300 miles to the east, a man with a handsome face and very careful hands had just learned where she was, and had started making plans. She woke up the next morning to the sound of an axe. Not an alarm, not a voice, just the clean rhythmic crack of steel against wood already going before first light, steady as a heartbeat. Eliza lay still for exactly 3 seconds, orienting herself the narrow bed, the wooden walls, the cold pressing against the window glass, and then she was up. Dressed in 2 minutes. In the kitchen in 3. Caleb had left the fire banked, but not built up. She fixed that first, then went through his kitchen with the systematic attention of someone reading a map. She opened every cabinet. She looked at every shelf. She picked up containers and read them and put them back. She was not snooping. She was assessing. There was a significant difference, and she was aware of it, even if she was the only one in the room. What she found was exactly what she'd expected from the outside. The ingredients were there. The quality was reasonable. But the organization was the organization of a man who had been feeding himself alone for years, functional in the immediate sense, completely blind to the longer view. Newer supplies stacked in front of older ones. Items grouped by no discernible logic. 3 different partial bags of the same grain in 3 different locations. Salt in 2 places. Coffee beans stored directly next to something damp that was slowly compromising them. She worked fast because there was breakfast to make, and she wanted it ready before he came in, and because she had a particular feeling that Caleb Storm was a man who would appear in that kitchen doorway at a moment she didn't expect. She was right. He appeared when she had exactly 8 minutes left on what she was making. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen. Not at her specifically. At the kitchen. At the way it looked different than it had the night before, subtly, but unmistakably, because she had already rearranged 3 shelves while the food was cooking. "I moved some things," she said without turning around. "I can see that. I'll explain the logic if you want to understand it. If you'd rather just tell me what's wrong with it, I can answer that too." A pause. "Neither," he said. "If it works better, I'll see it. If it doesn't, I'll say so." She put a plate on the table. Real food, not the perfunctory handful of whatever came to hand first, that she suspected constituted his usual morning routine. Protein grain, something warm. The kind of breakfast that meant something to a body about to do physical work in cold mountain air. He sat down. He looked at the plate. He picked up his fork. He didn't say thank you. She hadn't expected him to. But he ate every bit of it, and he ate it with the focused attention of a man who was noticing on some level that this was different from what he usually had. She filed that away and said nothing. "Root cellar first," he said when he was done. "You said yesterday it was the priority." "It is." "Then that's where we start." They went to work. The thing about working alongside Caleb Storm. Eliza discovered in the first 3 hours of that first morning was that he was extraordinary at the physical part of it and almost completely unaware of the systematic part. He could lift and carry and build and repair with an efficiency that was almost beautiful to watch, the economy of a man who had done hard physical work for so long that his body had organized itself entirely around the purpose. But he addressed problems as they appeared in the order they appeared, which meant he was perpetually solving the most visible issue rather than the root of it. She watched him start to address the ventilation problem from the wrong end entirely, and she said so. "That's the symptom," she said, "not the cause." He stopped. He looked at what he'd been about to do. He looked at her. "Explain it." She explained it. He listened, actually listened the way she'd noticed the night before, and when she finished, he stepped back from where he'd been working and moved to the actual source of the problem, without any of the defensive resistance that most men would have produced at being told they were starting in the wrong place. "You're right," he said simply, and they started over from the correct point. That was the first thing she learned about him. He had no ego about being wrong. None whatsoever. It was so unusual that it took her several more instances of it across the first few days to fully believe it was consistent. The second thing she learned about him was harder to name. It was something she noticed not in what he said, but in the specific way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not the way men usually watched her when they thought she wasn't looking, evaluating, measuring against a template, deciding whether she fit some category they already had prepared. This was different. This was the watch of a man trying to understand something he found genuinely puzzling. As though she were a problem he was interested in solving, but hadn't yet found the right approach to. It made her slightly uneasy. Not afraid. Just aware. On the third day they finished the root cellar work, and she reorganized the food storage from the ground up. It took the full day. Caleb worked alongside her for the morning portion, then stepped back and let her manage the arrangement while he dealt with some fence repair that had been waiting. He came back in the late afternoon and stood in the doorway of the newly organized cellar and looked at it for a long moment. "Tell me how this works," he said. She walked him through it. The rotation logic, the ventilation checks, the inventory markers she'd set up so he could see at a glance what he had and what he was running low on without having to dig through everything. He listened to every word. "This would have saved me," he said when she finished. He stopped. He seemed to recalibrate the sentence. "I've lost more food than I realized, over the years. It's a common problem," she said, "especially for someone managing alone. I should have caught it." "You were doing everything else," she said. "There's only so much one person can track simultaneously." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," she said. "They're not always the same thing, but in this case they are." Something happened in his face when she said that. Something very small and very quick there and gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. She thought about it later in the evenings when the work was done, and she was in her room listening to him move around the main cabin with his particular deliberate quiet. She thought about what it meant that a man could go so long without someone simply being accurate with him. Without someone looking at his situation and naming it plainly without exaggeration in either direction. She didn't pursue the thought too far. There was too much else to do. By the end of the first week she had reorganized the food storage, improved the root cellar, assessed the entire property's supply situation, and begun developing a winter plan that she wrote out in careful detail in the evenings. She showed it to Caleb on the 7th day. He sat across the work table from her and read every page of it without speaking. "The seed timing," he said finally. "What about it? You're planning around an earlier thaw than I usually see up here." "I'm planning around the average data," she said. "Your soil type and your altitude factor in. I cross-referenced it with your father's notebook." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. He went very still. "My father's notebook," he said. "I found it on the shelf with the other books. I should have asked before I used it. I apologize." A silence that had a different quality than the others. "You read it," he said. "I needed the historical planting data for this property," she said carefully. "I read the relevant sections. I didn't read personal entries." Another silence. "There aren't personal entries," he said. "My father wasn't a personal entries kind of man." "Neither were you, I imagine." He looked at her. The expression on his face was the most complicated thing she'd seen there yet, layered in a way that his usual directness wasn't. "No," he said after a moment. "I wasn't." She said nothing. She had learned faster than she'd expected that Caleb Storm's silences were not the silences of a man who had nothing to say. They were the silences of a man who was deciding something. She had learned to wait them out. "My father built this place," he said. "Started it anyway. I finished it." He stopped. "He died before he saw what it became." "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't always make it shorter," she said. Another of those quick, unreadable expressions, there and gone. He looked back at the winter plan. "The seed timing is still aggressive," he said. "But you might be right about the soil type. We can adjust if the thaw runs late." They returned to the plan. The moment closed over itself like water. But it stayed with her, the thing she'd glimpsed underneath it. It was on the 9th day that she went to Silver Creek for supplies. She hadn't wanted to go. Not because she was afraid of the town, she wasn't particularly, but because she'd developed a focused rhythm up at the ranch that she was reluctant to break. The work was good. It was real. It was the kind of work that showed results you could see and measure, and after months of effort that had led nowhere, the visibility of progress was something she found almost physically satisfying. But they needed supplies, and Caleb's list was specific and lengthy, and she was the more practical choice to go because she knew what she was looking for and could make decisions in the moment when the general store didn't have an exact item. "You don't have to," he said when she told him she'd go. "I know," she said. "I'm going." He handed her the list and didn't say anything else. But as she was saddling her horse, she heard him come out of the barn and stop a few feet behind her. "People in town will ask questions," he said. "Let them. They'll make assumptions." "They already have," she said. She didn't turn around. "I handled it before I got here, and I'll handle it now." A pause. "I know you will," he said, and he went back inside. She rode down to Silver Creek. The town received her with the particular quality of attention that small communities produce when something has disrupted their existing categories. She felt it the moment she came down the main road, the eyes that tracked her from windows and doorways, the conversations that paused and then resumed at a slightly different register. She kept her pace steady and her expression neutral, and she went directly to the general store. Aldrich, the owner, was a man who seemed to have made a personal philosophy out of treating everyone with the same minimal courtesy, regardless of what he privately thought of them. He took her list, worked through it methodically, and didn't ask a single question she hadn't invited. She appreciated him for it. It was on the way out that she heard it. She was carrying her purchases toward the door, the crate balanced in both arms, when two men near the back of the store reached the part of their conversation she was apparently supposed to overhear. "Storm must be desperate." That was Gideon Marsh's voice. She recognized it from her first morning in town. "Taking on someone like her." "What do you mean, someone like her?" The second voice was younger. "No connections, no family, no," a slight pause, delicate with implication, "history that anyone here can verify. A woman who shows up alone in a town where she doesn't know anyone and immediately goes to work for a man who lives by himself on a mountain." A short pause. "You draw your own conclusions." Eliza's hands tightened on the crate. She stopped walking. Not because the words had stopped her, she had heard worse. She stopped because she was making a choice deliberately and in full awareness of what each option would cost her. She could keep walking. She could say something. She could put the crate down and turn around and look Gideon Marsh in the eyes and ask him to repeat what he'd just said loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear it. She stood there for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to feel the full weight of each option. Then she turned around. Gideon Marsh saw her at the same moment she turned. She watched the color shift slightly in his face. Not guilt, not quite, but the involuntary physical response of a man who has been caught doing something he knows is small. He recovered quickly. He always would. He was that kind of man. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Perfectly pleasant. Practiced. "Mr. Marsh." She crossed the distance between them at a pace that required him to stay where he was or take an obvious step backward. She stopped close enough that the conversation was clearly private without being private. "I wonder if you could help me with something." His expression became the careful smile of a man who had decided the safest route was to appear cooperative. Of course. The assumptions you draw about a woman who takes an honest job with a fair employer. She said, her voice very level, very quiet. "I'd like to understand them better. Not because they matter to me, but because I'm genuinely curious what a man of your experience believes qualifies as evidence." The smile stayed in place, but behind it, something shifted. The younger man beside him was looking somewhere else with great determination. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Marsh said. "I'm sure you do," she said. "We both know that, so I won't waste either of our time pretending otherwise." She let a single beat of silence land. "Caleb Storm hired me because I know how to manage a winter food operation, and he needed someone who could. That's the complete and total extent of the story. It'll stay that way whether or not you choose to believe it." She picked up her crate. "Good afternoon, Mr. Marsh." She walked out of the general store without looking back. Her heart was beating considerably faster than normal. She stood at the hitching post and loaded her saddlebags with precise, controlled movements. She was not shaking. She refused to shake. What she was underneath the control was furious. Not the hot, bright fury that burned through fast and left nothing the other kind. The slow kind. The kind that settles in the bones and stays there, and quietly becomes the energy you use to do the next thing, and the next thing after that. She mounted her horse. She started back up the mountain. She was halfway up the trail when she became aware that she was not alone on it. The sound behind her was subtle, another horse moving carefully, not making unnecessary noise. She didn't slow her own pace, but she listened, and after another minute, she recognized the quality of it. Not threatening. Too deliberate to be accidental. She rounded a bend and stopped, turned her horse sideways across the trail. The man who came around the bend behind her pulled up short. He was young, early 20s at most, with the look of someone who had been riding fast and was now trying to compose himself into a posture of casual arrival. He was not quite succeeding. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He'd clearly been told her name. "I don't know you," she said. "Tom Briggs," he said. "I work for Mr. Marsh. A pause. "He sent me after you." The information settled over her like cold water. "He sent you," she said. "He wanted me to convey his—" The young man was struggling with his phrasing, clearly repeating something he'd been told, and not quite remembering the exact language of it. "He wanted to offer you an alternative arrangement. He said if you were looking for work, he might have a position after all." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Tom Briggs met her eyes for about 2 seconds, and then found something interesting to look at in the middle distance. "Tell me something, Tom," she said. "Ma'am. When I came to see Mr. Marsh 4 days ago, what made him unable to offer me a position?" A pause. He said you weren't suitable." "And what changed since this morning?" Tom Briggs opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't, ma'am. He asked me to carry a message." "I understand," she said. "Here is the message you can carry back." She looked at him steadily. "I have a position. I have fair terms and real work, and an employer who treats my skills as what they are worth. Tell Mr. Marsh I thank him for his consideration." She turned her horse back up the trail and kept going. She did not look back. Behind her she heard Tom Briggs sit on his horse for a moment in the trail. Then she heard him turn around and start back down. She arrived back at the ranch in the early afternoon. Caleb was at the barn, working on something with one of the horses. She could hear his voice low and steady, the particular tone a person uses with animals when they're trying to keep something calm. She unloaded the supplies and organized them into the storage system she'd established, checking each item against the list as she went. She was almost finished when she heard him come into the kitchen behind her. "Everything go all right in town?" he said. "Fine," she said. A pause. She had learned his pauses. This one meant he'd noticed the thing she wasn't saying. "What happened?" he said. She considered her options for exactly 1 second. "Gideon Marsh made comments in the general store, loud enough to be heard. I addressed them." Another pause. "How?" "I told him directly that his assumptions were wrong and why." She turned around to face him. "It won't change his opinion. I know that. But I wasn't willing to walk past it." Caleb looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something more like the look of a man who has just had a theory confirmed. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would be. He also sent someone after me on the trail," she said, "to offer me a job, after publicly implying I was unsuitable to have one." Caleb's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, very controlled, but she was beginning to know his face well enough to read it. "He what?" "He sent a young man, Tom Briggs, up the trail to tell me he'd reconsidered my suitability for employment." She kept her voice even. "I declined." Caleb stood very still. "He sent someone up my trail," he said, "to poach my employee." She almost laughed. Not from amusement exactly, but from the particular quality of his outrage. The fact that of all the elements of the story, the trespass on his property line was what had produced the sharpest reaction. "That appears to be what happened, yes. Marsh." He said the name like a statement, like something being filed. "He didn't want you when nobody else had you. The moment you're working for someone he already disrespects, suddenly you're worth pursuing." "That's generally how it works," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Did it bother you?" he said. What he said in the store. The question surprised her. Not because it was prying. It wasn't phrased as prying. It was phrased as a direct, sincere inquiry, the kind that assumed she was capable of being asked directly about her own experience without requiring it to be cushioned. "Yes," she said. "It bothered me." "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good. The day it stops bothering you is the day it's become normal to you," he said. "That's worse." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same level directness he brought to every other conversation, as though what he'd said was simply factual and obvious, which was, she thought, exactly how he meant it. "That's true," she said. He nodded. "Supper in an hour," he said, as though that settled it. "Yes," she said. And somehow it did. What she did not know, standing in that kitchen at the end of that particular day, was that Gideon Marsh's actions that morning had been watched. Not just by Tom Briggs, not just by Aldrich behind the store counter, but by another pair of eyes, someone who had arrived in Silver Creek the evening before, who had taken a room at the boarding house under a name no one in town had any reason to recognize, and who had been sitting very quietly in that general store looking at a magazine he had no interest in when Eliza Whitmore had walked in. He had watched her buy her supplies. He had watched her stop. He had watched her turn around and walk directly toward Gideon Marsh's voice. He had watched the whole thing, and he had smiled the smile of a man who had just been given very useful information about the person he'd come all this way to find. He had confirmed two things. First, that she was here. Second, and more importantly, that she was exactly as stubborn as he'd remembered. Nathan Caldwell folded his magazine, returned it to the rack, and left the general store without purchasing anything. He walked back to the boarding house in the cold Montana air, sat down at the small writing desk in his room, and began composing the first of the letters he would need to write. He had not come all this way to be in a hurry. He would let her settle, let her feel comfortable, let the mountain man she was living with grow to depend on her the way people always grew to depend on Eliza, because she made herself indispensable. She always had. It was the most consistent thing about her, and also the thing that made her so easy to find once you knew what pattern to look for. And then when the time was right, Nathan Caldwell was going to walk up to that mountain ranch and explain to Eliza Whitmore exactly why she was coming home. I was not worried about Caleb Storm. He had heard the stories about Storm in the 2 days he'd been in Silver Creek, and he understood without having met the man. The particular kind of isolation that the stories described. A man who had withdrawn from the world. A man who didn't trust people. A man who had organized his entire existence around the principle that connection led to loss. That kind of man Nathan knew could be managed. You simply had to convince him he was protecting something by letting go. He sealed his first letter and set it on the desk to send in the morning. Then he lay back on his bed in the Silver Creek boarding house and looked at the ceiling and thought about Eliza Whitmore's face when she'd walked into that store. Purposeful controlled that particular quality she had of moving through difficulty as though it were simply weather to be navigated. He had loved that about her once. That quality. That refusal to bend. He had also, when things had gotten complicated, found it exhausting. What he needed now was for her to understand that the circumstances had changed. That he had changed. That what he was offering her was better than a mountain cabin with a difficult man who probably couldn't begin to understand what she was worth. He was prepared to be patient. He was prepared to be convincing. He had always been very good at being convincing. Up on the mountain. Eliza finished making supper. Caleb ate across the table from her with his usual focused quiet, and she ate across from him with her usual focused quiet, and the silence between them was. She noticed it carefully, the way she'd been noticing things about this place, not the silence of absence. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was something else. The silence of two people who had found without planning for it that they did not need to fill every moment with words in order for the moment to have weight. She thought about that washing the dishes in the cold water from the pump while Caleb put more wood on the fire. She thought about how long it had been since she'd sat across from someone and not felt the specific low-level pressure of having to be something. Not having to be pleasant enough or composed enough or careful enough or useful enough in the way someone had pre-decided she was supposed to be useful. Caleb Storm didn't want her to be anything except what she actually was, which was either very simple or very complicated, and she wasn't sure yet which. She finished the dishes. She said goodnight. She went to her room. She stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the dark mountain forest, listening to the wind. She thought about Mrs. Dabb saying he lost something that changed him. She thought about the farming notebook on the shelf with the other books. She thought about the way his face had moved just slightly when she'd mentioned his father. Caleb Storm had built this mountain ranch as a refuge. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when she'd first ridden up the trail. He had not come up here because he was strange or difficult or dangerous. He had come up here because something had broken in him, and he had needed a place where the breaking was his own business and nobody else's. She understood that better than she would have admitted to anyone. She was still standing at the window when she heard it. A sound from outside, not the wind, not an animal. Something else. A branch weighted suddenly and unevenly. A footstep or close enough to one. She went completely still. Then she heard Caleb's door open in the main cabin. His footsteps crossed to the front door. She heard the door open. A silence. Then his voice very quiet and very flat saying, "You need to turn around and go back down the mountain." A second voice muffled through the wall, but she could hear it. Younger, nervous. "Mr. Storm, I'm from town. I came to—" "I know where you're from," Caleb said. "And I know who sent you. Tell him the answer is no. Tell him the woman who works on this ranch is not available for his arrangements, his positions, or his reconsiderations. Tell him if he sends someone up this trail again for any reason that isn't ranch business, he'll regret the decision." A long pause. Then, "Yes, sir." Footsteps retreating. Then silence. Then the sound of Caleb's door closing. Eliza stood in the middle of her room in the dark and looked at the wall between herself and the main cabin. Her throat was doing something complicated that she didn't entirely have a name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly, she hadn't asked for protection, and she wasn't sure she needed it. It wasn't surprise exactly. She was learning that Caleb Storm's responses to things were consistent in their directness, even when their content surprised her. It was something else. Something smaller and more specific. The particular sensation of someone having done something on your behalf without being asked, without announcement, without any expectation of acknowledgement. Not because they pitied you, not because they felt responsible for you, but simply because it was the right thing to do, and they were capable of doing it, and so they did. She had not felt that in a very long time. She lay down on her bed in the dark. She listened to the wind. She thought about the man on the other side of the wall back in his chair by the fire, returning to whatever he'd been doing before he'd heard the sound outside. She thought about Mrs. Dabb's words. He's not what the rumors make him. She was beginning to understand slowly, and with the careful attention of a person who had learned to build understanding piece by piece, rather than assuming she was beginning to understand that Caleb Storm was not a man who was broken. He was a man who had been hurt deeply and had responded to that hurt by becoming as self-sufficient as it was possible for one person to be. He had built a life in which he needed nothing from anyone, because needing things from people had cost him more than he was willing to spend again. What she had not yet understood, what she would not understand until much later, when the situation forced the understanding on both of them, was that self-sufficiency taken far enough was its own kind of loss. That a man who needed nothing from anyone was also a man who could receive nothing from anyone. And that this mountain cabin, for all its solid construction and its practical logic and its careful organization, was a place where Caleb Storm had been surviving for years. Not living, surviving. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep. And she was still thinking about it in a different and more complicated way when she woke up the next morning to the sound of an axe and started the whole cycle again. 3 days later, something happened that changed the temperature of everything between them, though neither of them acknowledged it at the time, and neither of them was prepared for what it meant. She was working in the barn with one of the horses, a gray mare who had been showing signs of lameness in the left foreleg, the kind of subtle progressive thing that a person who wasn't paying careful attention might miss until it became a serious problem. Eliza had been watching it for 2 days. She had her hands on the leg now, feeling for the specific heat signature that would tell her exactly where the inflammation was centered. She didn't hear Caleb come in. She was focused. She found the point she was looking for, felt the mare's response to the pressure, and said half to herself, "There it is." "What did you find?" His voice came from directly behind her, quiet and close, and she controlled her startled response by an act of will before it could turn into movement. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished what she was doing first, making a mental note of the location and the degree. Then she stood up and faced him. He was closer than she'd expected. Not inappropriately close, it was nothing like that. Just the close distance of a person who had approached while she was bent over her work and had stopped at a natural stopping point. But the cabin was their space of navigation now, and the barn was his, and she was suddenly very aware of both. "The inflammation is here," she said, indicating the point on the leg. She kept her voice completely professional. "It's early stage, caught it in time." He leaned past her, around her, really close enough that she could feel the cold air on his coat, and looked at the leg. Then he looked up at her. They were a very short distance apart. "What do we do for it?" he said. She told him. She explained the treatment, specific and practical, drawn from what she'd learned watching her father, and from what she'd read in the veterinary manual she'd found on his own shelf. He listened with the same complete attention he gave everything. But his eyes this time stayed on her face more than they stayed on the horse's leg. When she finished, he nodded. He didn't move back right away. He was doing the thing she'd noticed him doing sometimes, that thing where he stopped and looked at her as though she were a problem he was genuinely interested in and couldn't quite solve. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My father," she said. "And reading." "He was a good teacher." "He was," she said. "He believed women should know the actual work, not just the kitchen side of it." "He was right," Caleb said. There it was again. That simple, unqualified agreement that she couldn't quite brace for because nobody had trained her to expect it. He turned and went back to what he'd been doing, and she turned and kept treating the mare's leg, and neither of them said anything else about it. But that night at supper, the silence between them was different. She couldn't have explained exactly how. It had the same quality of not needing words. But underneath it, there was something new, a kind of awareness, mutual and unspoken, that the distance between them had shifted by some small but significant measure without either of them having done anything to cause it. She was not sure whether that was a problem yet. She suspected she would find out. The shift happened so gradually that neither of them named it. That was the thing about changes that actually meant something they didn't announce themselves. They accumulated in the space between two people, like sediment layer by quiet layer. Until one morning, you looked across a table and realized the distance you'd been maintaining had closed without your permission. It had been 3 weeks since Eliza Whitmore rode up that mountain trail with 5 rejections behind her and nothing in front of her but a man everyone in Silver Creek was afraid of. 3 weeks of work that was real and visible and cumulative. 3 weeks of mornings that started with the sound of an axe and ended with 2 people eating supper across from each other in a silence that had stopped being empty somewhere around day 10. She knew the ranch now, the way she'd known the Whitmore property, not just intellectually, not just as a list of tasks, but in her bones. She knew which boards in the barn floor were soft and needed watching. She knew the gray mare's moves and which of the cattle were the leaders and which followed. She knew that the eastern fence line lost heat fastest in the night wind and needed checking first thing on the coldest mornings. She knew that Caleb drank his coffee before he spoke his first word of the day, and that the first word was always practical and never social, and that this was not coldness, it was simply the way his mind came online. She also knew, though she had not said so to anyone, that something between them had been shifting since the night in the barn. Since he had stood close enough that she could feel the cold air off his coat, and looked at her with that expression she still hadn't found the right word for. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself the work was the thing that mattered. She was good at telling herself things. She was less good at believing all of them. On the morning of the 22nd day, she came into the kitchen and found Caleb already there, unusual, because she was almost always first. He was standing at the window with his coffee, not looking at the room, looking out at something beyond the glass. His shoulders had a quality she hadn't seen before, a held quality, the specific posture of someone managing information they hadn't fully processed yet. "Something happened," she said. Not a question. He turned. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, direct eyes. "I went down to the south fence line at first light," he said. "Someone had been on the property, overnight." The cold moved through her differently than the morning air. "How do you know?" "Boot prints, not mine, not yours." He set his coffee down. "Someone came up from the town road, walked the fence line for about a quarter mile, then went back. Not trying to get in, just looking." "Looking at what?" "The cabin, mostly. The sightline from that section of fence looks straight at the front of the property." She stood very still. She thought about Nathan Caldwell, and the fact that she had not thought about him in several days, which now felt like a significant oversight. She thought about the feeling she'd had in Silver Creek, that sense of being watched in the general store. The sensation of eyes that she'd attributed to the town's general surveillance of anything new and interesting. "Did you see anyone in town when you went for the Miller account last week?" she said carefully. Caleb looked at her with the focused attention of a man who understood that she was asking a specific question for a specific reason. "No one I recognized." "Why?" She made a decision. She had been holding this information back, not because she was hiding it, but because it had seemed like a thing from her old life that had no bearing on her new one. She was revising that assessment. "There's someone who might be looking for me," she said. "From Clearwater County. A man named Nathan Caldwell." The name landed in the room. Caleb's expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but she watched something in it become very attentive. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She told him about Nathan, the way she'd never told anyone, not the sanitized version, not the version where she was careful to be fair and balanced, and not sound bitter, but the actual version. Nathan Caldwell had come from money. He had been educated, well-spoken, capable of making everyone in a room feel like they were the most important person in it. He had courted her with the patience and precision of someone who had identified a target and was executing a plan. She had believed he loved her because he was very skilled at producing the evidence of love without carrying the actual weight of it. When her family situation changed, Nathan had not been cruel. That was the thing that had taken her longest to understand, that the absence of cruelty was not the same as the presence of care. He had been gentle. He had been regretful. He had explained with perfect reasonable logic why the arrangement they'd had was no longer viable for him. As though she were a business partnership that had stopped being profitable. "I wanted a wife who was also an asset," she said. "When I stopped being an asset, he wanted a different arrangement." Caleb had not interrupted once. He sat with his coffee going cold in front of him, and he listened to every word. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to have shape. "And you think he's here?" he said. "I think someone who knows what Nathan Caldwell looks like would need to tell me whether the man they saw in Silver Creek this week matches the description," she said. "Tall, dark blonde hair, well-dressed for a town like this. The kind of face that makes people trust him before he said anything." Caleb looked at her steadily. "I saw a man like that at the general store 4 days ago," he said. "I didn't think anything of it. Travelers come through." "They do," she said. "Usually they don't walk the fence lines of private property at night." Another silence. Then Caleb said, "What does he want from you?" She looked at him. "I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it won't be what he says it is. That much I know about Nathan Caldwell." Caleb stood up from the table. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out. She waited. She had learned to wait for him. "He won't come up here uninvited," he said finally. "Not yet. He'll try to reach you in town first or get a message to you somehow. He'll want to talk to you alone before he does anything public." She blinked. "How do you know that?" He turned. The expression on his face was complicated in a way she hadn't seen before. "Because that's what men like that do," he said. "They manage things privately first. They prefer to have the conversation they planned before anyone else hears a version they didn't control." Something in the certainty of it made her look at him differently. "You've dealt with someone like that before," she said. A pause. Not his usual thinking pause, a different kind. "Once," he said, "a long time ago." She did not push it. She stored it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things about Caleb Storm that were slowly assembling themselves into a picture she hadn't been shown all at once. His father's notebook. His 20 years alone on this mountain. The way he talked about loss, never directly, but always as though it were a country he'd emigrated from and knew the geography of precisely. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Keep working," she said. "I'm not going to change what I'm doing because Nathan Caldwell is in Silver Creek." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would." He went out to start the day's work. She started breakfast. But the kitchen felt different than it had 20 minutes ago, charged with something that the morning's revelation had introduced, and that the routine of work was not quite managing to absorb. She was right about Nathan. She knew she was right. And knowing she was right did not make it better. It was 2 days later when the first message arrived. Caleb brought it up from the fence line, where someone had apparently left it tied to the post nearest the road. A folded paper with her name written on the outside, in a handwriting she recognized immediately and viscerally, the way you always recognize the handwriting of someone who once mattered to you. Her name written in Nathan Caldwell's careful, educated script. Caleb handed it to her without comment. He watched her face when she saw the handwriting. She kept her face level. She opened it. The letter was short. 4 sentences. Written in the tone Nathan always used when he wanted something warm, reasonable, the language of a man who has thought about your feelings before his own and simply wants a chance to explain. He was in Silver Creek. He had heard she was in the area. He wanted only to speak with her briefly in town at a time of her choosing. He hoped she was well. He hoped she was well. After everything. 4 words at the end of 4 sentences positioned like they cost him something to write, designed to land exactly where they landed in that specific tender place where you had once believed someone's care for you was real. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She went back to what she'd been doing. At supper that evening, Caleb said, "Are you going to answer it?" "No," she said. He nodded. He ate. He said nothing else. But the next morning, there was a second message left at the same fence post. This one was longer. Nathan explained in the careful, measured language of a man making a case that he understood if she was angry. He understood that the way things had ended between them was not fair to her. He had thought about it, he said, over the months since. He had come to understand things he hadn't understood before. He was not asking her to forgive him immediately. He was only asking for a conversation. She burned it in the kitchen fireplace and went to work. The third message came on the fourth day, and it was different from the first two. Shorter. The warmth was still there, but underneath it, just slightly like a blade kept just out of sight, was something else. He had spoken with some people in Silver Creek, he wrote. People who seemed to have opinions about her current situation. He didn't want her to be in a position where misunderstandings could damage her reputation further. He only wanted to help. He hoped she would see that. She read it twice. Then she put it on the table and looked at it with the cold, analytical attention of someone reading a document for its actual content rather than its surface message. Caleb came in from outside and stopped when he saw her face. "What does it say?" he said. She slid it across the table to him. He read it. She watched his jaw tighten, that small, controlled movement she'd come to recognize as the outer limit of what he showed. He put the letter down. "He's threatening you," he said, flat, factual. "Carefully," she said. "He never says anything he couldn't explain away. He's saying he has influence in town, and he's willing to use it." "That's what he's saying, yes." Caleb looked at the letter for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to meet with him," she said. The silence that followed that sentence was extremely specific. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "But not answering him isn't making him go away. It's giving him space to do exactly what he threatened: work. The town build the narrative he wants, and make sure that by the time I do have to address it, he's already had 3 weeks to set the terms." She met Caleb's eyes. "I know Nathan Caldwell. I know how he operates. If I meet with him now in public on my terms, I control at least some of what happens next." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "In public," he said. "Main road of Silver Creek, middle of the day. As many witnesses as the town can provide." Another pause. "I'm coming with you," he said. She opened her mouth. "Not to speak for you," he said before she could. "Not to intervene. I'll stay back. But I'm coming down that mountain with you, and I'm being in that town when you have that conversation." She looked at him. The offer was so plainly what it was: not possession, not control, not the condescending protection of a man who didn't think she could manage, that she could not find a reason to refuse it. It was simply, "I will be present, in case you need someone to be present." "All right," she said. They rode down to Silver Creek the next morning. Nathan Caldwell was waiting in front of the general store, as though he'd known exactly when they'd arrive, which meant he'd either been watching the trail or he'd been told. He was dressed well better than anyone else on Silver Creek's main road that morning, which was itself a kind of statement about what kind of impression he was trying to make. He looked exactly as she remembered. Handsome face, easy posture, the particular quality of relaxed confidence that money and education produced in certain men. He saw her first. She watched his expression move through several things very quickly. Relief, warmth, something that might even have been genuine feeling. She had never been entirely sure with Nathan. And then he saw Caleb storm behind her, and something in his face recalculated. Eliza dismounted. She did not look at Caleb. She walked toward Nathan and stopped at a distance that was public and deliberate. "Eliza," Nathan said. He had a good voice. He always had. "You look well." "Nathan," she said. "Say what you came to say." Something flickered behind his eyes, the slight adjustment of a man who had planned a different opening and was revising on the fly. "I came because I owe you an explanation," he said. He said it with the quality of someone producing something they'd prepared, but producing it skillfully enough that it sounded spontaneous. "What happened between us, the way I handled things, it wasn't right. I've had time to think about that. You've had time, she said. And you've had a change of heart. Yes. And you came all the way to Silver Creek, Montana to tell me that. I came to ask you to come home, he said. The warmth in his voice stepped up a degree. Eliza, what you're doing here working for a man you barely know in a place that's barely a town, you deserve more than this. You deserve— Stop, she said. He stopped. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it clearly, because I'm going to say it once. She kept her voice very level. There were people watching them from the storefronts. Now she could feel it, the widening ring of attention that public scenes in small towns always produced. Good. Let them watch. You didn't come here because you had a change of heart. You came here because something changed in your circumstances. I don't know what it is yet, but something shifted in Clearwater County that made the arrangement you traded me for less valuable than you thought it was going to be. Nathan's expression didn't break. He was very good. That's not— And when that happened, she continued as though he hadn't spoken, you remembered that you'd let go of something that actually worked, and you came to get it back. She tilted her head slightly. Because that's what you do with things that work, Nathan. You keep them, not because you value them, because they're useful. The word landed. She watched it land. Useful. The same word Harold Sutter had used. The same word that sat underneath every version of every conversation she'd had in this town before she rode up a mountain trail to a man everyone was afraid of. She had borrowed the word back and aimed it precisely. Eliza. His voice shifted. The warmth dropped away a degree. Not all the way, never all the way with Nathan, but enough to show the shape of what was underneath it. You're making a mistake. Whatever you think you're building up there on that mountain, it's not real. The man you're working for is— He glanced at Caleb, still back by the horses watching. He's not someone you should be associating with. People in this town know things about him that you don't. What do they know? She said. That he's not right. That he drove his own family away. That the reason he lives alone up there is because nobody who's tried to be close to him has been able to stand it. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to the register of confidential concern. I'm trying to help you, Eliza, before this gets any worse for you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she knew about Caleb Storm. The farming notebook. The root cellar. The gray mare's leg. The way he had stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to her without waiting for a pause to form his response. The night he'd gone to the front door and told Tom Briggs to go back down the mountain without any announcement, without any expectation of thanks. She thought about the word Nathan had just used. Right. He's not right. The same configuration as not suitable, not useful, not what we want. The smooth, confident vocabulary of people who decided things before they looked. You're talking about a man you've never met, she said. And you're telling me things other people told you in a town that has never actually known him. You're doing exactly what you always do, Nathan. You're taking information that confirms what you want to believe and calling it knowledge. His jaw tightened. The first crack in the surface. Eliza, I'm not finished, she said, and something in her voice made him close his mouth. You want to know what I think is real and what isn't, I'll tell you. The work I do on that ranch is real. The food stores that won't fail this winter because I fixed the system, that's real. The mare who isn't going lame because someone finally looked at her carefully enough to catch it early. That's real. She paused. And the man you're telling me isn't right has listened to every word I've said for 3 weeks without once deciding he already knew the answer before I gave it. That's more than you ever managed. Silence on Silver Creek's main road was total. Nathan Caldwell stood very still. He was recalculating. She could see it the way a chess player recalculates when the board has shifted to a configuration they didn't expect. She had known this moment would come. She had known that at some point the warmth and the reasonableness and the careful language would run out, and what was underneath would have to show itself. You're making a choice, he said. His voice was quiet now. The performance was still there, but thinner. A very specific choice. I want you to understand what you're choosing. I understand perfectly, she said. You're choosing to stay up on that mountain with a man nobody in this county trusts over coming home to a life that's— Nathan. She said his name with a finality that cut through the rest of the sentence. There is no home to come back to. You dissolved that when you sat across a table from me and explained why I no longer fit your plans. You were very kind about it, and I'm not angry about it anymore. But you don't get to dissolve something and then reclaim it when the new arrangement doesn't work out the way you expected. He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that might have been real. A genuine reaction unplanned. She'd seen it before in him, those rare flashes of the actual person underneath the performance. She'd spent a year believing those flashes were the truest version of him. "Eliza," he said, and his voice was different, stripped of the rhetoric. "I made a mistake." She felt it. She felt the pull of it because she was human, and because she had loved him once, or had believed she loved him, which amounted to the same thing while it was happening. She felt the particular gravity of a genuine admission from a person you'd once trusted. She let herself feel it. And then she looked at it clearly. "Maybe you did," she said. "But that's not the same thing as me making a different one." She turned and walked back toward the horses. She heard Nathan behind her. "This isn't finished," he said. Not threatening, not quite, but with an edge that hadn't been there at the start of the conversation. She stopped. She did not turn around. Caleb Storm was beside her in 2 steps. He had stayed back the whole conversation exactly as he'd said he would. He had not intervened once, but he was beside her now, and when Nathan spoke again, it was to both of them. "Storm," Nathan said. He had recovered the surface. He was smooth again, controlled. "I imagine she hasn't told you everything about herself, about her family, about why she ended up here alone." Caleb looked at him. The look was the specific, unhurried look of a man who is entirely unimpressed and completely unafraid, which was in Eliza's experience the most devastating combination available to a human face. "I know what I need to know," Caleb said. "You know what she's told you." "I know what I've watched," Caleb said. "Every day for 3 weeks. I know how she works and what she's built and what she's worth." He paused, and the pause was deliberate. "That's more than you know, and it tells me more than anything you could say." Nathan's composure held, but barely. "You're making a decision based on 3 weeks, he said. "I knew her for 2 years. "You knew her for 2 years, Caleb said, "and you let her go. That tells me what I need to know about your judgment." The silence that followed that sentence had a different quality than all the other silences of the morning. Eliza, standing between them, felt it in her chest, a pressure that was not pain, not quite, but was adjacent to something that had been waiting a long time to move. Nathan looked at Caleb. He looked at Eliza. He was very still for a long moment, and she watched him decide something. The particular micro-expression of a man who has assessed a situation and determined that the ground has shifted in a way he did not anticipate and cannot quickly correct. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Eliza said. She mounted her horse. She didn't look at Nathan again. She heard Caleb mount beside her, and they turned north, and they rode. They were halfway up the mountain trail before either of them spoke. The silence between them on the ride up was not like the silence at supper, not like the silence in the barn. It was charged with everything that had just happened, full of the weight of words that had been said in public and the ones that hadn't been said at all. Caleb broke it first. "You all right?" he said. 3 words, plainly asked, no performance around them. "Yes," she said. Then, because he had earned honesty and she was tired of giving anything less, not completely, but mostly. He nodded. He rode. After another few minutes she said, "What you said to him?" "I meant it," he said, simply, without elaboration. She looked at him riding beside her on the narrow trail, looking ahead with that steady forward quality he brought to everything. She thought about what he'd said. "You knew her for 2 years and you let her go. That tells me what I need to know about your judgment." Said without heat, without performance, without any of the trappings of a man making a speech. Just a man stating a fact he believed. She turned back to the trail. She did not say anything else, but something in her chest, something she'd been holding tightly and at a distance for a very long time, shifted in a way that she noticed and did not immediately try to rearrange. They got back to the ranch in the early afternoon. They worked the rest of the day in the comfortable rhythm that 3 weeks of shared labor had built between them, and neither of them brought up Silver Creek or Nathan Caldwell, or the things that had been said on the main road. But at supper, she put her fork down and looked across the table at him. "He'll come back," she said. Caleb looked up from his plate. "He said this isn't over," she said. "Nathan doesn't say things like that without meaning them. He'll regroup and he'll come back with a different approach, something I'm not expecting." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll deal with it when it comes," he said. "I don't want to bring more trouble onto this ranch than I already have." "You haven't brought trouble," he said. "Trouble found you. There's a difference." She looked at him. "You didn't sign up for this when you offered me work." "No," he said. "I signed up for an honest arrangement with someone who knew what they were doing." He held her eyes. "That hasn't changed." She held his gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than their usual. Then she looked back at her plate. "All right," she said. They finished supper. She washed the dishes. He put wood on the fire. The cabin settled into its evening quiet. She was almost at her door when he spoke from across the room. "Eliza." She turned. He was standing by the fire, and he looked for the first time since she'd known him like a man who was uncertain. Not about facts, not about work, not about the practical realities of the situation. About something else entirely. Something personal enough that it had gotten through whatever barrier he maintained between himself and that category of vulnerability. "The thing he said," Caleb said, "about people not being able to stand being close to me." He stopped, started again. It's not entirely wrong. I have been told that. By someone who mattered. It's why Another stop. He looked at the fire. "I want you to know that I'm aware of it. That I've been aware of it the whole time you've been here. And that whatever you've decided about this place and this arrangement, I want it to be a real decision. Based on what's actually here. Not on what you needed when you came up the trail." The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had just offered her something she suspected he did not offer anyone, a clear, unguarded look at the thing he was most afraid of. Not the thing other people feared about him. The thing he feared about himself. "I know what's here," she said quietly. He looked at her. He didn't ask her to say more. He was a man who had learned to take things at the value they were given and not push for more than was offered. "Good," he said, and he turned back to the fire. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and she listened to the wind in the pines, and she thought about Nathan Caldwell standing on Silver Creek's main road, saying this isn't over. She thought about the way he'd looked at Caleb, the assessing look, the recalculating look, the look of a man filing information away for later use. Nathan was not finished. She had known him too well and too long to believe otherwise. He was a man who treated every situation as a problem to be solved, and he would not leave Montana until he had either solved this one or exhausted every approach available to him. She thought about what form the next approach would take. She thought about what he'd said about things she hadn't told Caleb about her family, about why she'd ended up here. He had been reaching for something with those words, gesturing at information he believed he could weaponize. She thought about what that information might be. She thought about her father's debts, which had been a matter of public record in Clearwater County. She thought about her brothers, who had signed papers Nathan's family had drawn up during the sale process. She thought about what a careful, educated man with money and connections, and a lawyer's understanding of how things worked, could do with that information if he chose to use it. And then she thought about Caleb Storm, standing on the other side of the wall in the firelight, who had spent 20 years on this mountain, because someone had told him he was too much and too difficult, and people couldn't stand being close to him. Who had believed it at least partly, and built his life around the belief. Who had tonight shown her the wound underneath the wall, trusting her not to press on it. Nathan Caldwell was coming back. She was certain of it now. What she was not certain of, what she would not be certain of until it happened, was what he was going to say when he got here. What version of the truth he was going to bring with him. What he had learned in his days in Silver Creek and his careful conversations with people who thought they knew things that he intended to use. She lay back on the narrow bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling. The wind picked up outside, moving through the pines with the particular sound of a Montana night getting serious about the cold. She listened to it. She let it be what it was. She was not afraid of Nathan Caldwell. But she was very, very tired of men deciding things about her life that she had not authorized them to decide. And she could feel in the particular way that someone feels a storm coming before it arrives, that the moment she'd been building toward since she rode into Silver Creek with 5 names on a map was getting close. That whatever was going to happen next was going to require everything she had. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She let herself rest, because rest was not weakness. It was preparation, and she had learned the difference. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the fire settled in the grate. And across the wall, Caleb Storm sat in his chair and looked at the fire with his particular quality of stillness and thought about things he had not thought about in a very long time. Neither of them slept as easily as they usually did that night. And in Silver Creek, in a room at Mrs. Dabb's boarding house, Nathan Caldwell sat at his writing desk with 3 letters in front of him. Letters he had written and not yet sent. Letters to people in Clearwater County who could provide him with exactly the kind of information he needed. He looked at them for a long moment. He thought about Eliza's face on the main road. He thought about Caleb Storm's voice saying, "You let her go, that tells me what I need to know about your judgment." I thought about what it meant that she had found in 3 weeks on a mountain, with a man everyone called dangerous, something she had never quite found in 2 years with him. He picked up a pen. He added a 4th letter to the stack. He was going to need more than he'd brought with him. But he had time. He had patience. And he had resources that neither Eliza Whitmore nor Caleb Storm had any reason to anticipate. He sealed the letters. He set them aside for morning. He lay back on his bed and looked at the ceiling of Mrs. Dabb's boarding house and thought about the word she had used on the main road. Useful. He turned the word over in his mind like something sharp. He thought about what it cost him that she was right. He thought about what it cost him that she knew she was right. And he thought about what it was going to take not to win her back. He had revised that goal already, but to ensure that if he couldn't have what he'd come for, no one else would have it either. The fire in his room burned low. The Montana night pressed against the window. Nathan Caldwell stared at the ceiling and made the kind of quiet, reasonable, utterly cold decision that men like him made when the acceptable options had run out. He would need a few more days, and then he would go back up that mountain. 4 days passed after Silver Creek. 4 days of work and supper and the kind of silence that had earned its weight. And then on the morning of the 5th day, Tom Briggs rode up the trail again. Eliza was in the barn when she heard the horse. She came out and saw Caleb already standing in the yard, arms crossed, watching the trail with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and is not surprised it has arrived. Tom Briggs looked worse than the last time she'd seen him. Pale, uncomfortable, the expression of someone who had been given a job he wanted no part of, and had no clean way out of it. "Mr. Storm," Tom said from the edge of the yard. He had the sense at least not to ride all the way in uninvited. "Miss Whitmore, I've been asked to deliver something." "By Caldwell," Caleb said. "Yes, sir." "Say it and go," Caleb said. Tom reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He looked at it like it was something that might bite him. "Mr. Caldwell has retained a lawyer from Billings," he said. "He's filed a claim with the county land office in relation to the Whitmore family property in Clearwater County. He says—" Tom glanced at Eliza, and something in his face said he genuinely wished he were anywhere else. "He says that there are outstanding debts against the estate that Miss Whitmore's signature is required to settle, and that if she returns to Clearwater County voluntarily, the matter can be resolved without another glance, without public proceedings." The yard was very quiet. Eliza did not look at the document. She looked at Tom Briggs. "Tell me something," she said. Her voice was steady. "Did Mr. Caldwell tell you what those debts are?" Tom shifted in his saddle. "He said they were connected to the sale of the ranch property. He said there were agreements signed that—" "Did he tell you," she said, "that those agreements were signed by my brothers after the property was already sold without my knowledge or my signature?" Tom's mouth closed. "Did he tell you that whatever claim he's making through a Billings lawyer rests entirely on documents I never saw and never authorized?" Tom looked at the document in his hand. He looked at her. He looked at Caleb. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "He did not tell me that." "No," she said. "I didn't think he did." Caleb took 2 steps forward and held out his hand. Tom gave him the document without hesitation, with the relief of someone surrendering something they hadn't wanted to be holding. Caleb looked at it for a moment. His jaw did the thing it did when he was managing something. "Tell Caldwell," Caleb said, "that Miss Whitmore has seen the claim. Tell him she's aware of the specific documents he's referencing and their origin. Tell him if he intends to pursue this through a Billings lawyer, we'll be consulting our own." Tom blinked. "You have a lawyer." "We will," Caleb said, "by the end of the week." Tom Briggs rode back down the mountain considerably faster than he'd come up. Caleb stood in the yard and read the document again. Then he looked at Eliza. "Your brothers," he said. "Sold whatever they could when the ranch went under," she said. "I wasn't there. I was dealing with my father's affairs. By the time I knew what they'd signed, it was done." She paused. "I didn't think Nathan would find it. I didn't think he'd consider using it." "You underestimated him," Caleb said. "Not accusation, fact." "Yes," she said. "I did." He folded the document and put it in his coat. "I meant what I said, about the lawyer." "Caleb, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. He looked at her directly. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference." She looked at him standing in the yard with the document in his coat and that level, unshakable expression. And she felt something move in her chest that she had been very carefully not feeling for several weeks now. She pushed it back. There were practical things to address. "There's a lawyer in Miles City," she said. "Robert Hale. He handled land cases in Clearwater County. He knew my father. He might know enough about the original sale to challenge Nathan's claim." "Write him today," Caleb said. "I'll take it down to the post office myself." She wrote the letter that afternoon. She wrote it at Caleb's work table with his maps and notes around her, using the clear, precise language she'd learned from years of managing documentation on the Whitmore ranch. She laid out the facts in order. She explained the sequence of the sale, her brother's actions, her own absence from the relevant proceedings. She asked Hale to assess the claim and advise whether Nathan Caldwell had anything real to work with, or whether this was what she suspected, a pressure tactic dressed in legal language. Caleb read it when she was done. He read the whole thing without comment. Then he said, "Good. Send it exactly as written." She handed it to him. Their fingers overlapped for a moment on the paper, just a moment, half a second, and neither of them remarked on it, but she was aware of it with a precision that had nothing to do with the letter. He wrote it down that afternoon. She stayed at the ranch and worked, and the working helped, and by the time he returned at dusk, she had moved herself back to the practical side of the problem and mostly stayed there. "Post office is closed Sundays," he said when he came in. "Hale will have it Tuesday." "Thank you," she said. He sat down at the table. He looked at her for a moment. "Are you afraid?" he said. The question surprised her because it was exactly the right question. Not, "Are you worried?" Not, "Is this a serious problem?" But "Are you afraid?" specific to her, to the interior experience of what she was carrying. "A little," she said honestly. "Nathan has resources I don't have. If he's genuinely retained a lawyer and filed a proper claim, he can make this complicated and expensive, even if he can't ultimately win it." "He can make it complicated," Caleb said. "He can't make it true. Those are sometimes different problems," she said. "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father had a land dispute once. Someone tried to claim part of the northeast section of this property, based on a survey error from 20 years before. Took 2 years to resolve." He paused. "He didn't lose. But it cost him, and not just money. It cost him the particular kind of thing. It costs you when someone attacks something you built, and you have to defend it instead of develop it." He looked at the table. "I was young, but I remember what it did to him." She looked at him. He was giving her something, not just information, but context. History. The kind of thing he didn't give easily or often. "Is that why you're helping me?" she said carefully. "Because of what it did to him?" He met her eyes. "No," he said. I'm helping you because what's being done to you is wrong, and I'm in a position to help stop it. And those two facts together don't leave me much room to do nothing." She held his gaze. "That's a very Caleb Storm answer," she said. Something happened in his face, the closest thing she'd seen to a smile, not on his mouth, but in his eyes, a brief warmth that was there and gone before it could be classified. "I suppose it is," he said. They had supper. They cleaned up. The evening settled around them, the way evenings had been settling for weeks. Comfortable, weighted with unspoken things, the kind of quiet that existed between people who had stopped performing for each other. She was washing the last dish when he spoke. "The night I came back from town," he said. He was by the fire. He didn't look at her. "I rode past the spot on the trail where I first saw you, where you'd stopped with your horse." She put the dish down. She turned. "I thought about the first conversation we had," he said. "In this room. You told me you weren't coming up here because you needed someone to rescue you." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot. About the fact that that was the first thing you said that wasn't about your qualifications." She waited. "I told you I was offering respect," he said. "And I meant it. But I've been—" Another pause. Longer. The kind that meant he was choosing words carefully. "I've been thinking about whether I've actually given you that, or whether I've just kept my distance and called it respect." She was very still. "Because there's a difference," he said, "between treating someone well because you're decent and treating someone well because they specifically matter to you. And I've been careful not to say which one it is." He looked at the fire. "That's not fair to you, given everything you're dealing with, given what Caldwell is trying to do." She crossed the room. Not all the way. She stopped a reasonable distance away, the distance of a person who is not retreating, but is also not presuming. "What are you saying?" she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. He turned to look at her. The firelight made everything in his face readable in a way that the even daylight didn't. And what she read there was the expression of a man who had been alone for a very long time and was standing at the edge of something he had convinced himself he would never stand at again. "I'm saying that you matter to me," he said. "Specifically, not as an employee, not as someone I'm protecting because it's the decent thing to do." He stopped, looked at her directly. "I don't have a practiced way to say this. I haven't said anything like it and it's been a long time." "Say it the unpracticed way," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because of the work, because of you. Because this cabin is—" He stopped again, started again. "Before you came here I thought I had built something complete. Everything I needed and nothing I didn't. And then you came, and I could see very quickly all the things that were missing. Not in the ranch." He paused. "In me." The fire settled. The wind moved through the pines. Eliza Whitmore stood in Caleb Storm's kitchen and looked at a man who had just handed her the most unguarded thing she had ever been given by anyone, wrapped in the plainest possible language, without decoration, without strategy, without any safety net at all. She thought about what she had built herself against over the past year. The specific, careful structure she had erected around the part of herself that had once believed Nathan Caldwell when he said he loved her. She had not built that structure because she was cold, or because she didn't want things. She had built it because wanting things, and being wrong about whether you'd have them, was one of the most costly mistakes a person could make. She looked at Caleb Storm. She thought about whether she was wrong. She thought about 3 weeks of evidence. Real evidence, not the kind Nathan had been so good at producing. Not performance, not language. Not the careful assembly of the appearance of something real. The actual thing. A man who listened. A man who said what he meant. A man who had driven down a mountain to send a letter she hadn't asked him to send, because she needed it sent. She was not wrong. "I don't want to leave either," she said. "And not because of the work." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He exhaled. A long, slow breath, the specific release of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been told it's safe to put it down. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to, not right then. The distance between them was the distance of two people who had just agreed on something significant and were standing in the moment of it before the moment became a decision. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The person who told me I was too difficult," he said. "That people couldn't stand being close to me." He stopped. "It was my wife." The word dropped into the room like a stone. She did not react outwardly. Inside, several things reorganized themselves. "I didn't know you'd been married," she said. "Few people do," he said. "It was before the mountain, before all of this." He looked at the fire. "Her name was Clara. We were married for 3 years. She was from a family in Billings, educated, accustomed to a certain kind of life. I tried to give her what she wanted. I wasn't built for the social parts of it. The events and the appearances and the way you were supposed to talk to people about things that didn't matter." He paused. "She told me at the end that she felt more alone with me than she had before we married. That I was present in the room, but absent in every way that actually counted." Eliza looked at him carefully. "Was she right?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he said. "I was young. I knew how to work and how to be straight with people and how to build things. I didn't know how to be known." He paused. "She left. She remarried someone in Billings within the year. And I came up here because—" He stopped. "Because it was easier to decide I was built for solitude than to keep trying something I kept failing at." "You weren't failing," she said. He looked at her. "You were mismatched," she said. "That's different. A person who needs a certain kind of life and a person who can't give it to them. That's not failure. That's two people who were wrong for each other." She held his gaze. "Being straight with people isn't a flaw, Caleb. Being present without performance isn't a flaw. Those are the things She stopped herself. Started again. "Those are the things I've spent 3 weeks being grateful for." Something in his face shifted. Fully shifted this time. Not the small, controlled movements she'd been learning to read, but a real movement deep enough to change the whole quality of his expression. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. "I know," she said. "So when I tell you that the past 3 weeks have been the first time in a long time that this place has felt like somewhere I was glad to come home to." He stopped. "I need you to know I mean that." "I know you do," she said. "That's why I believe it." She crossed the remaining distance between them. She was not impulsive. She had never been impulsive. It was not in her nature. This was not impulse. This was the decision of a person who had looked at all the available evidence and reached a conclusion that the evidence supported. She took his hand, just his hand, held it for a moment. He looked down at her hand in his. He looked up at her face. Something moved in his eyes that she had no name for and didn't need one. "I don't know how to do this well," he said quietly, meaning more than the conversation. "Neither do I," she said. "I thought I did once. I was wrong about that." She looked at him steadily. "But I know how to do things I don't know how to do. I just start, and I keep going, and I pay attention. That's all I've ever done." "That's what you've been doing here," he said. "Yes," she said. "And so have you. You just haven't been calling it that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his hand over and held hers properly, the full deliberate hold of a person who has made a decision. "All right," he said for the second time that evening. But this time, it meant something different. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep and real, not the managed, competent expression she had been producing for an audience of skeptical men in Silver Creek. This was just a smile, uncalculated. He looked at it like it was something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with, which made her smile more. "Don't look so surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. He almost managed to sound like he wasn't. They stood there for a moment longer. Then, because they were both practical people with work in the morning, she said goodnight and went to her room. But she was still smiling when she closed the door, and she was fairly certain from the quality of the silence in the main cabin that she was not the only one. The letter from Robert Hale arrived 11 days later. Caleb brought it up from town along with supplies, and she opened it at the work table with him, standing a few feet away, in the particular posture of someone who is trying to appear unconcerned and not quite succeeding. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she put it down and looked at Caleb. "He says the claim is weak," she said. "The debts Nathan is referencing were settled as part of the original sale. My brother's signatures were obtained after the settlement was complete, which means they signed documents that had no legal standing. Hale says Nathan may have found a Billings lawyer willing to file a claim, but any competent judge will see through it in an afternoon." Caleb let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for 11 days. "He also says," she continued, "that Nathan Caldwell has a history of this kind of approach, using legal paperwork as leverage without intending to actually pursue it. He's aware of at least 2 other cases in Clearwater County where Caldwell family attorneys filed claims that were dropped when the other party didn't immediately capitulate. He does this regularly," Caleb said. "It's a pattern," she said. "Apply pressure, see who backs down. If they don't back down, quietly withdraw. He counted on you not knowing your own position well enough to hold it." "Yes," she said. Caleb picked up the letter and read it himself. She watched him read, watched the line of his jaw, the specific focused attention he brought to anything that mattered to him. When he finished, he set it down carefully. "We should write Hale back today," he said. "Tell him to respond formally to Caldwell's lawyer, on record. Make sure there's documentation that we're aware of the pattern and we're not backing down." "I agree," she said. He looked at her. "This isn't over either," he said. "He'll try something else." "I know. But this particular weapon is gone," he said. "He doesn't have the legal angle anymore." "No," she said. "He doesn't." She wrote the response letter that afternoon. Caleb read it and added 2 sentences she hadn't thought of, specific legal language that Hale had included in his letter, that when reflected back made clear exactly how informed they were. She looked at his handwriting next to hers on the draft. 2 different hands on the same page, and thought about what that meant and didn't say anything about it. They sent the letter. They waited. What came back 4 days later was not from Hale. It was not from Nathan's Billings lawyer. It was Nathan himself in person, and he did not come alone. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 men, both well-dressed, both the kind of men whose clothes said money, and whose faces said they'd been hired to stand there and say it louder. He rode up the trail without sending a messenger first, which told Eliza something. It meant he'd given up on the approach of managing things quietly. Whatever he'd come with now, he intended it to be witnessed. Caleb saw them coming from the barn and came out. He was holding a fence tool, not as a weapon, but as the natural result of having been interrupted mid-work. Eliza came out of the cabin. They stood together in the yard. Eliza had wondered sometimes what it would feel like facing Nathan Caldwell with Caleb Storm beside her. She had thought it might feel like being protected, which she didn't want, or like being represented, which she also didn't want. It felt like neither. It felt like standing next to someone who was on her side. Completely unconditionally, without agenda. The feeling was so specific and so clean that it was almost disorienting. Nathan pulled up and dismounted. His 2 men stayed on their horses. He looked at Eliza and then at Caleb, and the assessment in his eyes was calculating in a way he was no longer bothering to hide. "Eliza," he said. "Nathan," she said. "You've been busy." "I have," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I want you to look at this." "I'm going to need you to tell me what it is first," she said. "It's a sworn statement," he said, "from your brother James, attesting that you were in fact present and aware of the agreements signed after the ranch sale, that you knew about them and chose not to disclose them." The world went very quiet around her. She heard Caleb very slightly shift his weight beside her. She thought about James, her brother, who was charming and careless, and who had never in his adult life thought about the consequences of his actions before he took them. Her brother, who had signed those documents without reading them because someone asked him to, and it was easier than asking questions. Her brother, who Nathan Caldwell had apparently found, and with money or persuasion or both, convinced to sign a statement saying something that was not true. She looked at the document. She looked at Nathan. "My brother," she said, "is not a reliable witness." "He's a blood relation with direct knowledge of the events," Nathan said. "A court will find him credible." A court will also hear from Robert Hale, she said. About the settlement documents, about the timeline, about the fact that what your statement claims is contradicted by the public record of the sale. Nathan's composure was very good, but she had known him for 2 years, and she could see behind it. He had expected her to react to James's name. He had expected the betrayal to land hard enough to shake her position. It had landed hard. She was not pretending otherwise, not to herself. James had signed a false statement, and whatever relationship existed between them would carry that forever. But she was not going to let it move her feet. You brought 2 men with you, she said. Why? Nathan glanced at his companions. Witnesses, he said. To what? Caleb said. His first words of the encounter. Quiet. Even. The particular quality of a man who has been listening carefully and has identified the thing worth asking. Nathan looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, the recalibration she'd seen before the recognition that Caleb Storm was not the obstacle he'd anticipated. To the conversation, he said. No, Caleb said. You don't need witnesses for a conversation. You need witnesses for a transaction or a confrontation. Which is this? Nathan looked at him for a long moment. Storm, he said, and now the warmth was entirely gone from his voice. I want to talk to Eliza alone. No, Caleb said. It's not your conversation to participate in. It's my property you rode onto, Caleb said. And she's... He stopped. He looked at Eliza, and in that look and the half, second before he finished the sentence, she saw him decide something. She saw him choose between the safe word and the true one. She's not your employee, Nathan said into the pause. He said it with the confidence of a man playing a card he'd been holding. Is she not anymore? Because that's what the town says. That's what people in Silver Creek have been saying for weeks. That Caleb Storm hired a woman nobody wanted, and now they're living up here together, and it's not a professional arrangement anymore. He let that land. So when you say this is your property, and she's whatever she is to you, you're making an admission that changes her legal standing in relation to the claim I've filed. Eliza's jaw tightened. Caleb looked at Nathan Caldwell for a very long moment. Then he said, every man in Silver Creek looked at her and saw what they expected to see. You're doing it right now. You came up here expecting to find a woman who'd been taken advantage of, and a man who'd taken advantage of her, because that's the only story that makes sense to you. He took one step forward, not threatening, just closing the distance enough that it was clear the step was deliberate. I looked at what she'd survived. That's the difference between you and me. That's why you're standing in my yard trying to use her brother's name as a weapon, and I'm the one she's standing next to. The yard was completely silent. Nathan's 2 men were very still on their horses. Nathan Caldwell stood with his document in his hand, and his composure fractured at every seam, and he looked at Eliza with an expression that was for the first time in her experience of him entirely unmanaged. She saw in it something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation. Loss. Genuine, unguarded loss. The expression of a man who had just understood fully and without softening what he had thrown away, and exactly how irretrievable it was. She almost felt sorry for him. She examined that impulse carefully and let it exist without acting on it. The claim will be withdrawn, she said. You know it will be. Hale's response made that clear. And you know James's statement won't hold up against the sale documents. She looked at him steadily. So you came up here for something else. You came up here because you needed to see it. Because you needed to look at it directly. She let that sit. You've seen it, she said. Now you can go. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. Something moved in his face, closing a decision. The look of a man putting something away that he will never take out again. He folded the document. He put it back in his coat. He turned to his horse. He stopped with one foot in the stirrup and looked back at her one more time. She had wondered in the weeks before this moment if she would feel something when it ended. A closing or a relief, or even a grief for the version of herself that had believed in him. She felt something. But it was quieter than she'd expected. More like the end of weather than the end of something important. The storm had been real when it was happening. And now the sky was just the sky again. Goodbye, Eliza, Nathan said. Goodbye, Nathan, she said. He rode down the mountain. His 2 men rode behind him. The sound of the hooves faded through the trees, and then was gone, and the mountain returned to its usual silence. She stood in the yard beside Caleb and looked at the empty trail for a moment. He won't come back, she said. Not a question. No, Caleb said. He won't. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had names for, now the one she had been accumulating names for, over weeks of careful attention. The expression that meant he was seeing her clearly, all of her, without adjustment. You didn't finish your sentence, she said. When you were talking to him, you said she's, and you stopped. He looked at her. I know, he said. What were you going to say? I was quiet for a moment. The Montana sky above the ranch was enormous and blue and entirely still. The pines were motionless. Everything was very quiet. That you're mine, he said. That I was going to say you're mine, and then I realized I hadn't asked you yet, and that seemed like the wrong order. She looked at him. She felt something rise in her chest that was not managed and not controlled, and that she made no attempt to push back. Ask me, she said. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, the eyes that had been seeing her clearly since the first moment she came around a bend in a mountain trail and found him standing in her way. Will you stay? He said. Not as an employee, not because you have nowhere else to go, because you want to be here. He paused. With me. She thought about what it had cost her to ride up this mountain. About 5 doors and 5 rejections and a map with 1 name left on it. She thought about a man who had listened when no one else would, who had said the work is real and the arrangement is fair, when what he had actually been offering, though neither of them knew it yet, was something much larger than either of those things. She thought about what it felt like to stand next to someone and feel not protected, not represented, but accompanied. Genuinely, completely accompanied. Yes, she said. I want to be here. He nodded. One slow, certain nod. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do in all the weeks she'd known him. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face very gently. The way a man touches something he has wanted to touch for a long time, and is allowing himself to finally without the restraint that caution had been requiring of him. She leaned into it slightly. Just slightly. The fraction of a degree that means everything. I'm not easy, he said quietly. I know, she said. I'm not either. We're going to have disagreements. We already have, she said. We're still here. Something moved in his face that was warm and real and entirely unguarded. Yes, he said. We are. He dropped his hand. They stood in the yard in the Montana morning. Above them the sky continued its enormous indifference. Around them the ranch, their ranch, though neither of them had said that word, yet went on being exactly what it was. Solid. Real. Built to last. She thought about the woman who had ridden into Silver Creek with a small bag and 5 names on a map, and the determination to rebuild her life through honest work. She thought about what she had been looking for. She had told herself she was looking for a job. That was true as far as it went. But the deeper truth, the one she could admit now with Nathan Caldwell, riding back down the mountain, and Caleb Storm standing in the yard beside her, was that she had been looking without knowing she was looking for exactly this. A place where the work was real, a person who saw her clearly, a life that fit the actual shape of who she was. She had found all 3 of them in the last place anyone in Silver Creek would have looked. On a mountain, with a man everyone was afraid of, in a life that nobody had predicted for her. She went back inside to make lunch. Caleb went back to the fence tool he'd been holding when Nathan arrived. She could hear him working through the kitchen window, the particular rhythmic sounds of a man doing a thing he knows how to do, at the pace that the thing requires, without hurry and without waste. She thought about what he'd said. She's mine, and then I realized I hadn't asked you yet. She put a pot on the fire. She started chopping vegetables with the quick, efficient movements of a woman who knows her way around a kitchen, who knows her way around a ranch, who knows finally solidly without doubt her own worth. She was smiling again. The real kind. Outside the axe found its rhythm. The mountain held its ground. And two people who had each lost something real and built a wall around the loss were discovering day by careful day that walls kept the cold out, but they also kept everything else out, and that the risk of letting someone through was terrifying and necessary, and the only way that anything actually whole ever got built. They were not finished building yet. She knew that. There were things between them still unsaid, still unresolved. The particular accumulation of two complicated lives that would take more than a few weeks to fully know. There would be disagreements and silences, and the inevitable friction of two strong-willed people learning to share a space and a future. But the foundation was real. The work was real. And the man on the other side of the wall was real in every way that mattered, not performing, not managing, not calculating the return on what he offered. Just present. Fully, completely, honestly present. That she had learned was rarer than anything else in the world. And she had ridden up a mountain trail in the last light of a Montana afternoon to find it. The morning after Nathan Caldwell rode down that mountain for the last time, Eliza woke up before the axe. That had never happened before. In all the weeks at Storm Ranch, Caleb had always been first, the axe going before first light. The fire banked, the day already starting by the time she came into the kitchen. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn quiet and listened. Nothing. Just the pines and the wind and the particular deep silence of a mountain morning before anyone has decided to interrupt it. She got up, dressed, went to the kitchen. Caleb was at the table, not working, not reading, not doing any of the practical things she associated with him at that hour. Just sitting with his coffee, looking at nothing specific, in the posture of a man who had been awake for some time and had been doing his thinking without witnesses. He looked up when she came in. Something in his face was different than it had been yesterday. Not worse, not troubled, but quieter in a way that ran deeper than his usual quiet. "You're not outside," she said. "No," he said. She started the fire. She started the coffee. She worked without asking him to explain himself, because she had learned that Caleb Storm's silences, when they were this particular kind, were not silences that needed filling. They were silences that needed company. She sat down across from him with her own cup. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. After Clara left, he said, "I told myself a story. About what I was and what I wasn't. About the kind of man who could have a life with another person, and the kind who couldn't." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I told myself that story long enough that it stopped being something I believed and became something I simply knew. The way you know the layout of your own property. You stop thinking about it. It's just true." She listened. "You didn't argue with the story," he said. "You didn't try to convince me it was wrong. You just existed differently than the story said was possible, and after a while the story stopped holding." She looked at him across the table. "When did it stop?" she said. He thought about it. Actually thought about it. She could see him locating the specific moment with the same careful precision he brought to anything that mattered. "The root cellar," he said finally. "The second day. When you told me I was starting from the wrong end, and you were right, and I knew you were right immediately, and the first thing I felt wasn't defensive. It was—" He stopped. "Relieved," he said. Like I'd been waiting a long time for someone to just be right about something, without it costing me anything to admit it. She felt something move in her chest, slow and deep. "That's when you stopped being afraid of me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I was never afraid of you," he said. "You were," she said gently. "Not of what I'd do, of what I'd make you feel." A long pause. He looked at his coffee. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's accurate." She reached across the table and covered one of his hands with hers. He turned his hand over immediately the way he had the night before, that full deliberate hold that said he had made a decision and was not retreating from it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. And then so quietly she almost missed it. "That's the part I'm still getting used to." She squeezed his hand once and then let go, because there was breakfast to make and a day to start, and they were both people who understood that the most important things didn't require lengthy ceremony. They required showing up every morning and doing the next thing. She made breakfast. He went outside. The act started later than usual, but steadier than ever. The days that followed had a different quality than the ones before. Not because the work changed, because the work was the same and always would be, but because the silence between them had shifted one final time into something that was no longer holding anything back. They moved around the ranch and around each other with the ease of people who have stopped calculating the distance between themselves, which is one of the finest feelings available to human beings and one of the rarest. She still had her room. He still had his. Neither of them had addressed that specifically. Some things moved at their own pace, and she was not in a hurry, and she suspected he was not in a hurry, and the fact that neither of them was in a hurry was itself a kind of proof about what was real between them. She wrote to her brother Thomas, not James. Not yet. She was not ready for James, and told him where she was and what she was doing. She kept the letter practical. She told him she was well. She told him the work was good. She did not tell him about Caleb, because that was not something she was ready to put in a letter to someone who was still in his own imperfect way a part of her family. She thought about forgiveness. Not the performative kind, not the version of forgiveness that was really just a rearrangement of hurt into something more socially acceptable. She thought about the real kind, the kind that took a long time and happened in stages and didn't require her to pretend James hadn't done what he'd done. The kind that was not about him at all, actually, that was about her, and about what she was willing to carry forward, and what she was willing to set down. She was working on it. That was all she could say about it right now. She was working on it. 3 weeks after Nathan Caldwell left the mountain, something happened that she did not expect. Gideon Marsh rode up the trail. Not with 2 men, not with documents, not with the energy of someone arriving to apply pressure. He came alone and slowly with the careful posture of a man who has made a decision he's not entirely comfortable with and is committed to it anyway. Eliza was at the barn when she heard him. She came out. Caleb appeared from the direction of the east fence line, covering the distance with his usual unhurried efficiency, and stood a few feet back. Marsh dismounted. He was holding his hat in his hands, which was not a posture she had ever associated with him. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now finding the rehearsed version inadequate. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Marsh," she said. A pause. "I'll say this directly," he said, "because I think you're a person who prefers it that way." "I am," she said. "I made a mistake," he said. "When you came to see me about work, I made a decision based on—" He stopped, started again. "I made a decision based on what I assumed rather than what I knew. And I've had occasion to hear through the winter what you've done up here, what you've built, what you know." Another pause. "And I'm here because I think I owe you the acknowledgement that I was wrong." The yard was quiet. Behind Marsh, Caleb stood with his arms crossed, saying nothing, his face completely neutral in the way that meant he was listening very carefully. Eliza looked at Gideon Marsh. She thought about the specific quality of his smile that first morning, that patient, almost kind smile of a man doing her a favor by turning her away quickly. She thought about what it had felt like to walk out of his office and cross the first name off the map. She thought about what it had cost her over the following days to keep going, to knock on the next door, to maintain the belief that her worth was not determined by another person's blindness to it. "What changed?" she said. Marsh blinked. He had expected she thought something different. Acceptance, perhaps. Dismissal. Not a direct question about the mechanism of his revision. "My winter stores," he said. "I lost nearly a third of them by February. The way I've been running the storage, the way I've always run it, it failed this winter, worse than it ever has before. I talked to Aldrich at the store, and he said you'd consulted with him about a storage system 2 months ago, that you'd sorted out a problem he'd had for years in an afternoon." He looked at his hat. "I went over and looked at what you'd done, and I understood that I'd turned away the person who could have solved my problem before it became one." She studied him for a long moment. "You need help with your storage system," she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to advise me," he said. "Paid, of course. Properly paid. And I want to be clear, I'm not asking you to come work for me. I understand that ship has sailed, and I understand why." He looked up at her. "I'm asking because you know something I don't know, and I have enough sense left to admit it." She glanced at Caleb. He was looking at her with the particular expression she'd come to know, the one that said, "This is entirely your decision, and I will back whichever one you make." No opinion offered, no pressure applied. Just, "I'm here, and this is yours." She looked back at Marsh. "I'll come by next week," she said. "One afternoon. I'll assess the situation and tell you what you need to change and why. After that, you implement it yourself, or you find someone to help you do it." "That's fair," Marsh said. He put his hat back on. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was not quite shame, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has done something he can't undo and is living in the specific discomfort of that knowledge. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been telling people what you've done up here, what you know. I can't take back what I said before, but I can make sure people have better information going forward." She nodded. "I appreciate that," she said. And she meant it not effusively, not with warmth she didn't have for him yet, but genuinely. It was not nothing what he'd done. It had cost him something to ride up that trail and say it. He left. Caleb walked over and stood beside her. "One afternoon," he said. "One afternoon," she confirmed. "And he pays for it." Something in Caleb's expression moved in that way. She loved the almost smile that lived in his eyes rather than his mouth. "Good," he said. Marsh was not the last one. In the weeks that followed, the trickle that had started with his visit became something steadier, not a flood. Silver Creek was not a town that reversed its positions dramatically or all at once, but one by one, with the slow, slightly grudging quality of a community, admitting it had been wrong about something, people found their way to Eliza Whitmore, the woman from the boarding house. Mrs. Dabb came up on a Saturday with a problem about her kitchen garden's soil that had been defeating her for 2 seasons. Eliza spent 40 minutes with her, asked 6 questions, identified the drainage issue that was the actual source of the problem, and told her exactly how to fix it. Mrs. Dabb stood up from the garden, looked at her and said, "I should have found a way to help you when you came to my door." "You did," Eliza said. "You came after me on the road that first day." "That wasn't enough," Mrs. Dabb said. "No," Eliza agreed. "But it wasn't nothing." Mrs. Dabb came back the following week with preserves she'd made, using a technique Eliza had mentioned in passing. She left them on the kitchen table without ceremony, and said she hoped they were acceptable. They were excellent. Eliza told her so. It was a beginning. The feed store owner. 2 ranchers from the south end of town. A woman who'd married into a farming family and had no one to teach her the practical knowledge she needed. They came one by one, some with genuine humility, and some with the more complicated combination of need and discomfort that people produce when they require help from someone they once dismissed. Eliza helped all of them. Not because she had forgotten what they'd done. She hadn't forgotten, and she didn't pretend to. But she had something her father had tried to teach her for years, and that she had only recently fully understood, that helping someone who wronged you was not the same as excusing what they did. It was simply doing the right thing, regardless of what they'd done, which was its own kind of power. The cleanest kind. Caleb watched this process with the quiet, observational attention he brought to everything. And one evening at supper he said, "You're not doing this to prove something." She looked up. "No," she said. "What are you doing it for?" She thought about it. "The work is real," she said. The soil problem Mrs. Dabb had, that was a real problem with a real solution. It doesn't matter to the problem whether or not she was kind to me when I came to town. She paused. "And I don't want to spend the rest of my life sorting people into the ones who were wrong about me and the ones who weren't. That's a way of letting what they did keep organizing my time." He looked at her for a long moment. He stopped. "What?" she said. "That's exactly what I should have done," he said quietly. "Years ago, with the town. Instead of coming up here and deciding they didn't deserve the trouble." The silence that followed had weight. She looked at him carefully. "You're not wrong for being up here," she said. "You built something real up here." "I built something alone up here," he said. "There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "There is." He looked at his plate. "I'm going to go to town more," he said. "Not to be sociable. That's not going to change. But I've been staying away because it was easier, and easier isn't always right. She said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. She understood the size of what he'd just offered, even though it was wrapped in plain, practical language. Caleb Storm announcing he would go to town more was not a small thing. It was the mountain coming slightly toward the valley, the wall lowering by one deliberate stone. "I'll come with you sometimes," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." They finished supper. She washed the dishes. He put wood on the fire. And then, because he was a man of action more than words, and had apparently been thinking about something, he said from across the room, "Come outside." She looked at him. "Just for a minute," he said. She dried her hands and followed him out. The Montana night was enormous. That was the only word for it, enormous, in the specific way that only a mountain sky at night can be, when you are far enough from any town that the stars are not competing with anything and simply exist in their full, staggering quantity. She had seen this sky many times in the weeks at Storm Ranch. She had never quite gotten used to it. Caleb stood beside her and looked up. He was quiet for a long moment. She waited because she had learned that his silences at moments like this always resolved into something worth waiting for. "My father used to say," he said, "that the only honest thing about being alive was that you couldn't see where you were going." He paused. He meant it as a complaint, I think. He was not a man who liked uncertainty. A pause. "But I've been thinking about it differently lately." "How?" she said. He looked at her. The starlight was doing something to his face that made it look different than the daylight did. Softer, she thought. Though that was not quite the right word for a face as angular and direct as his. More open, maybe. More willing to be read. "You couldn't have planned any of this," he said. "Not the ranch failing, not the 5 rejections, not the trail up here. None of it went the way anyone would have planned it." "No," she said. "It didn't. But you're here," he said. "And I'm here. And the root cellar doesn't lose a third of the stores anymore. And the gray mare isn't going lame." He paused. "And I'm going to town more." She almost laughed. She let herself. It came out quietly, warmly, the kind of laugh that comes from genuine delight and not from anything performed. "Those are your criteria for a life that worked out," she said. "Those are the things I can see and measure," he said. "The other parts I'm still figuring out how to describe." She looked at him. She thought about everything she'd been through to arrive at this specific moment, on this specific mountain, under this specific sky. She thought about all the times she could have stopped, could have turned around, could have decided the weight was too much and the doors too closed and the forward motion too uncertain to keep going. She thought about what had kept her moving. Not stubbornness exactly, though she had that. Not desperation, though she had felt that too. Something older than both of them. The specific knowledge, deep and unargued, that she was not finished yet. That the story was not over. That the thing she was looking for was real and therefore findable. And that stopping before she found it would be the one mistake she would not recover from. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to just listen without immediately saying something practical." The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile. "I'll try," he said. "When I rode up this trail," she said, "I told myself I was coming for a job. I told myself that every door before this one had been closed for unfair reasons, and that this was the only option left, and I was going to treat it like any other professional arrangement and not put more weight on it than that." She paused. "I was wrong." He waited. "I was coming for something I didn't have a name for yet," she said. "A place where the work was real and the person next to me was real, and I didn't have to manage what I was to be acceptable to anyone." She looked at him directly. "I found all of it. I found it in a place everyone told me not to go with, a person everyone told me to be afraid of." She paused. "I need you to know that I know that. That I'm not here because there was nowhere else to go. I'm here because this is where everything that was missing is." I was very still. "I'm not good at this either," she said, "at saying it directly, but you deserve direct." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had loved since before she knew she loved it. The full, unguarded attention of a man seeing something clearly and not looking away. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took both her hands this time. Held them in the steady, deliberate way that was entirely his. Not gentle, exactly, but careful. The way a man handles something he is very serious about not breaking. "I chose you," he said. "Not because you were here and it was convenient. Not because you were capable and the ranch needed it. Because I saw what you had survived and what you had built out of it, and it was—" He stopped. "It was the most impressive thing I had ever seen, and I wanted to be near it." He paused. "Near you." She looked at him. She thought about Silver Creek. She thought about 5 rejections in 2 days. She thought about Harold Sutter saying, "I need someone useful, not someone I have to worry about," with that flat and comfortable certainty. She thought about all of it, the whole weight of it, and she thought about this moment, this man, this mountain, and she understood something that she would carry for the rest of her life. She had never been impossible to love. She had simply been surrounded by people who lacked the willingness to look. "I know," she said. "I know you chose me. That's the thing that changed everything." He pulled her forward gently, and she let him, because she was not retreating from anything anymore, and hadn't been for weeks. And she leaned against him in the Montana night under the enormous stars, and he put his arms around her with the same quality he put into everything, fully, deliberately, without reservation. They stood there for a while. The cold was significant, but neither of them moved. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. His voice was quieter now, lower near her ear. "Ask it," she said. "Stay here," he said. "Permanently. Not as my employee. Not as someone who's decided this is the best available option." He paused. "As my wife, if you want that. If it's what you want." She was still for a moment. She thought about the question. She thought about whether she needed time to think about the answer. She did not need time. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He exhaled against the top of her head. The same breath she'd heard when she'd told him she wanted to stay, that specific release of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been told they can put it down. "Good," he said. His voice was entirely steady, and she could hear everything underneath it. "You're going to have to go to town for a ring," she said. A pause. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. She smiled against his coat. "You don't have to go tomorrow." "I know," he said. "I want to." She pulled back slightly and looked at his face. He looked back at her with that expression, open, clear, the walls entirely down. She had spent weeks learning the architecture of Caleb Storm's defenses, not to dismantle them, but to understand what they were protecting. And now that she could see past them, what she found was not complicated. Just a man who had been hurt and had healed wrong and needed someone willing to sit with him while he healed differently. She was willing. She had always been willing. She just hadn't known it was him she was willing for. "One thing," she said. "What?" "When we go to town to deal with the arrangements, the formalities, whatever needs doing," she said, "I want to walk into Silver Creek beside you. Not behind you, not following." "Beside me," he said. "That was never a question." "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it anyway." He nodded. She turned back to the night sky and leaned against him again, and they stood there under all those stars, until the cold finally won the argument, and they went back inside. She lay in her room that night, her last weeks in this room. She thought since after they spoke to the minister it would be different, and she looked at the ceiling, and she let herself feel all of it. The full weight of it. Not managed, not at a careful distance, not with the protective numbering she'd learned to do over the past year. All of it, the actual thing, the size of what had happened. She thought about her father. She thought about him with a clarity and a warmth that she hadn't been able to access since he died, because grief had been between her and the memory muddying it. She thought about him sitting at his desk with the farming notebook she now kept on the same shelf where she'd found it, making his careful notes about soil and seasons, teaching her in the specific way of people who teach by doing, rather than by explaining, by bringing you alongside them and showing you the work. She thought about what he would have said about Caleb Storm. She thought he would have said very little and needed very little time to assess the situation, because her father had been above everything else. A man who knew the difference between someone who worked and someone who performed the idea of working. He would have watched Caleb for one morning and known. She hoped he would have been glad. She believed he would have been glad. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Silver Creek with a small bag and a map and 5 names. She thought about how that woman had felt walking out of Harold Sutter's yard with 5 rejections behind her and 1 impossible name left on the list. She thought about the very specific quality of that feeling. Not defeat, not quite, but the near relative of it. The feeling of looking at a road that has narrowed to a single path and not being sure the path goes anywhere. She wanted to tell that woman something. She wanted to say, keep going. Not because it gets easier. Not because the people who turned you away were wrong and will be made to regret it. But because the thing you can't see from here is real. The man no one warned you about correctly. The work that fits the exact shape of your hands. The life that looks nothing like what you planned and turns out to be the only one that was ever actually yours. Keep going. One more trail. One more door. One more direct conversation with a person everyone told you to be afraid of. Keep going. Because the best things don't announce themselves. They just stand in the path and they ask what you're offering and they listen to every word you say. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the pines. The fire settled in the grate on the other side of the wall. And in the main cabin, the man who had looked at what she'd survived and called it impressive was doing exactly what he always did at the end of a day. Putting the fire in order, checking the locks, making sure everything that mattered was secure. Making sure she was all right. Not because she couldn't make sure of it herself. Because he wanted to. Because she was his. And that was what you did when something was yours. You took care of it, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but out of the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of being responsible for something that mattered. She fell asleep to the sound of a man who had spent 20 years surviving on a mountain, finally coming home to something worth the trouble. In the morning, the act started before dawn. She started breakfast before he came in. They ate across from each other in the comfortable silence that had its own language now built from weeks of shared mornings and honest conversations and the accumulated weight of choosing each day to be exactly what they were without apology. He rode it down to Silver Creek that afternoon. He came back up the trail at dusk with a small package in his coat pocket, which he placed on the kitchen table without ceremony while she was finishing supper. She looked at the package. She looked at him. "I told you tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I went today." She opened it. It was a simple ring, not elaborate, not extravagant. The choice of a man who knew the difference between decoration and value and had chosen accordingly. She picked it up and held it for a moment. "It's right," she said. "Good," he said. She put it on. They looked at it for a moment, both of them in the quiet kitchen of the cabin they had built together out of what had been one man's survival and one woman's determination, and the improbable, irrefutable fact of 2 broken people finding each other on a mountain in Montana. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and clear, and full of stars that didn't care about the history of the people beneath them, which was exactly the kind of indifference that was in its own way a comfort. The mountain held its ground, as it always had. The ranch sat solid and real against the cold, the food stores full and properly organized, the gray mare sound. The fences repaired the cabin warm with a fire built by 2 pairs of hands that had learned each other's rhythms. Eliza Whitmore had come to Silver Creek with a small bag, a worn notebook, and the kind of determination that has no name because it doesn't need one. She had been turned away by 5 people who looked at her and saw limitation. She had been told she was not useful, not suitable, not what anyone wanted. She had ridden up a mountain to the one man no one wanted her to go near, and she had shown him what she was worth, and he had been brave enough or honest enough, which in his case amounted to the same thing, to see it. The feared mountain man did not choose her because no one else would. He chose her because he was the first person with eyes clear enough to recognize who she had always been, and she wore his ring on her hand in the warm kitchen of a home that was finally completely irrevocably hers, and she was not waiting for anyone's approval, and she was not holding anything back, and she was not afraid. She had ridden up a mountain on borrowed daylight with 5 doors closed behind her, and she had found on the other side of the last impossible climb the only thing that had ever been worth finding. A man who saw her. A home that held. A life built on the one foundation that never fails, the truth of what you are seen clearly by someone who chose to look. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole story, and it was true.